Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. My channel isn't monetized, so if you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Chapters 301 through 310 of the previous episode. Amidst the demonic chaos in Blusher Prefecture, Chun Ping'an battles the corrupted Golden City God. Using his deity drumming technique and golden talismans, he shatters the demonic seal, restoring the deity's true consciousness and receiving a priceless scholarly core in gratitude. Chun then hurries to the Zhao residence, deploying his flying swords to eliminate a demonic cultivator and rescue a dying girl named Luan Luan. Pushing himself to the absolute limit, Chun draws a high-grade, life-saving talisman with his own blood. When opportunistic assassins try to ambush his exhausted state, he decisively summons his flying swords to execute them. After the crisis is resolved and the city is safe, Chun imparts his martial arts to a kind-hearted local boy. Resuming his southward journey with his friends, Chun continues to train relentlessly, even as he faces a frustrating new bottleneck in his martial arts cultivation. Thank you. Now, let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Xianxia laughed loudly and said, "We can indeed do business. I mean, doing business with others has always been my favorite thing. However, I dearly hope that you won't ask for too high a price, senior. Otherwise, I definitely won't buy anything. Perhaps you aren't too familiar with the type of person I am, so let me explain this to you. For the sake of cultivation, I'm even willing to sell my own sons or grandsons. However, I'm quite well off now, and I've returned to my hometown with money and glory. I somewhat miss my parents after seeing the buildings in the small town, and that's why I feel a small urge to act on my feelings of nostalgia. There's a young girl called Li Lu. She went to complete Reed Continent in the north with her parents," Old Man Yang said slowly. "The souls of your parents are in her possession now. If you're willing to make a fair transaction, then I'll be willing to do business with you as well. I guarantee that everything will go smoothly. At that time, your parents' souls will be returned to you with their whiskers and tails fully intact. Of course, you can also go back on your word and attempt to forcefully snatch the souls of your parents. If that's the case, then you can turn around and leave now. You'll be fully responsible for what happens in the future." There was a wry smile on Xiaoxi's face as he replied, "Whiskers and tails, Senior Yang, your figure of speech is far too unpleasant. All right, name your price." Old Man Yang used his smoking pipe to point at Xiaoxi's wrist. Xiaoxi was enraged, and he exclaimed, "What the heck? You want me to give my bonded flying sword to that Li Lu? Old Man Yang, have you gone crazy?" Old Man Yang shot a sideways glance at him and continued, "You've always kept the other flying sword that you had before refining this great river, correct? You can give that flying sword to Li Lu. Remember to teach her the sword technique as well." There was a dark expression on Xiaoxi's face. Xiaoxi chuckled coldly and said, "Don't feel like you're suffering a loss. You've never taken a good disciple in your life, so I'm essentially giving you one for free right now. Perhaps everyone will say this when they mention you in the future. Oh, Xiaoxi? You mean Li Lu's master?" Xiaoxi was slightly intrigued by this. He rubbed his hands together and clicked his tongue in wonder, asking, "The girl is this powerful?" Old Man Yang pursed his lips and replied, "Why, look for her and find out. I'm sure that you'll be extremely willing to hand your flying sword over to her when you see her. Then it's a deal. If I want to gamble, then I'll take a big gamble. Only a big gamble can live up to great sword immortal Chao's name." Xiaoxi slapped his thigh and exclaimed. He then lowered his voice slightly and asked, "Is there anything else apart from this? Are there any other transactions we can make?" "Your father's soul," Old Man Yang replied calmly. Xiaoxi was taken aback. However, he immediately rolled his eyes and said, "Forget about it. I wouldn't want it even if you paid me to take it." Old Man Yang started to, "I can allow Chao Jun to join the army of the Great Li Empire and temper his sword heart on the battlefield. I can ask someone to protect him in secret for 20 years, all the way until his sword heart is fully healed," Old Man Yang said in a solemn voice. Xiaoxi's expression turned serious. "Don't try to push your luck?" Old Man Yang scoffed. "Which is more important, your face, or an additional terrestrial sword immortal in your clan?" There was a troubled expression on Xiaoxi's face, and he replied, "Chao Jun is clearly an ungrateful brat. If he becomes a terrestrial sword immortal in the future, then won't he try to overthrow me? Having two sword immortals in a single clan will indeed allow us to stand up straight and be proud people no matter where we are. Oh no, I should say proud immortals. But really, who knows whether that brat will seek revenge on me in the future?" Old Man Yang completely ignored this and said, "Anyway, when Chao Jun becomes a terrestrial sword immortal, he has to promise me one thing. Rest assured, I won't tell him to die or whatever. This task won't be too difficult for Chao Jun at that time. Chao Shi was slightly puzzled. Senior Yang, why don't you look for Chao Jun yourself and discuss this with him? Perhaps there are some other schemes and considerations? The two of us can be considered fellow townsmen, so you shouldn't screw me over even if we don't shed tears of emotion upon seeing each other. Right? Chao Jun doesn't have the right to do business with me now. But you do, Old Man Yang replied bluntly. Chao Shi was rendered speechless. When he finally left the Yang family's medicine shop, Chao Shi stood on the street and glanced back at the pharmacy. That old man Chen Chunan wouldn't have predicted these matters as well, would he? He murmured to himself. It was late at night, and a wealthy-looking young boy in brocade robes dazedly sat in a courtyard. Before the cultivator from the School of Naturalists was killed by his imperial uncle, Song Chongjing, in the capital, he had once visited him and had a shocking discussion with him. In fact, the old man had even revealed his huge scheme against the emperor of the Great Li Empire. He had persuaded the emperor to cultivate in secret, thereby breaking the rules established by the Confucian sages. Not only had the emperor reached the middle 5 tiers in secret, but he had even continued upward and advanced to the 10th tier without much difficulty. The emperor had chosen this path in the hopes that he could see the Great Li Empire conquer the entire continent. Meanwhile, the naturalist cultivator had enacted this scheme so he could transform the emperor, Song Jisun's father, into an obedient puppet. When the emperor of the Great Li Empire officially entered seclusion to advance to the upper 5 tiers, that would be the moment he lost his sentience and transformed into a puppet. However, Alyang's arrival had shattered the emperor's bridge of immortality. At the same time, it was extremely likely that the emperor had noticed some traces and clues when his bridge of immortality had shattered. The traps hidden inside his bridge of immortality had most likely been exposed. Even though the emperor had concealed his emotions extremely well on the plaza outside the White Jade capital, he ultimately hadn't imagined that the cultivator had tampered with his son's body as well. No matter what, Alyang's punch had completely ruined the intricate plan of the naturalist cultivator. This was a plan that his branch of naturalists had carefully put together and executed for dozens of years. Even so, things were far from over. Right now, Song Jisun was feeling extremely solemn as he recalled those words. What's wrong, young master? Is there something weighing on your mind? Jigui walked over and asked. Song Jisun turned around and replied with a smile. No, I'm just unable to fall asleep. Jigui nodded and carried a stool over to sit next to Song Jisun. The moon is bright and the view is good. So why don't we take a little stroll? Song Jisun suddenly suggested. All right, I'll listen to you, young master, Jigui replied in a lazy voice. They were still master and servant, and they walked through the streets and alleys of the small town together. When they arrived next to the stone table behind the old private school where Mr. Qi had taught in the past, Song Jisun reached over and ran his hand over the ice-cold surface of the go table. He had sat on the north seat every time, while Zhao Yao had sat on the south seat every time. Back then, he hadn't understood why this was. Now that everything was clear, however, he finally understood the reason behind this. Song Jisun smiled and said, I wonder how Zhao Yao is doing right now. Jigui became quieter than usual after arriving here. Afterward, the two of them continued to stroll around without purpose. They walked to wherever their hearts took them. The iron chain had already been removed from the iron lock well by a man from the outside. This iron chain was also a fated opportunity for immortals. The black cat from Apricot Blossom Alley had seemingly left the small town with that quiet retard Ma Kuxuan. The old sword blade under the covered bridge, which had been torn down to reveal the stone arch bridge again, had also vanished without a trace. It was also rumored that Sage Ruanqiong was soon going to found his own sect on one of his large mountains. This was sure to be a grand event. The Great Li Empire's Ministry of Rites treated this as the most important event for the tail end of spring, and they spent many resources and much effort to organize the ceremony. The two neighboring shops in Dragon Riding Alley, the Burklover shop and the pastry shop, had both been bought by an owner with the surname Chun. This was truly astonishing. After all, almost everyone with the surname Chun in the small town was a slave or servant of the 4 families and 10 clans. The constructions of the new Wunchong Pavilion and Martial Sage Temple were already complete. They were located at the Immortal Tomb and the Mountain of Porcelain, and they honored the old ancestors of the Yuan clan and the Chao clan, respectively. They were the 2 jade pendants who had brought renewed prosperity to the Great Li Empire, and it could be said that they had been returned to their hometown now. There were many couplets written by famous scholars and literati. In fact, even renowned scholars and literati from the distant southern stream nation personally wrote couplets and sent them over. Their brush strokes were powerful and fearless. Song Jisun pursed his lips outside the temple honoring the sages. Ha! Upright and fearless. In the end, the prince of the Great Li Empire turned around to gaze at the tall mountains in the distant west. He was looking in the direction of Downtrodden Mountain. There was a mountain god temple with few worshippers and few incense offerings there. As the young boy gazed at the distant downtrodden mountain, a downcast expression appeared on his face. He seemed weary. Besides the grand temple that honored the formal god of Northern Mountain on Cloud-Draped Mountain, there were also many ordinary mountain god temples on the tall mountains in the west. Among them, the mountain god temple on Cool Wind Mountain enjoyed the most worshippers and incense offerings. This was because it was located close to the prefectural city of Dragon Spring Prefecture. Moreover, it also had the widest and most even mountain path, making it fairly easy to visit. There were also tea shops and restaurants along the way, as well as small and large inns for worshippers to stay in. These shops and inns popped up one after another like bamboo shoots after spring rain. There was a marketplace at the foot of the mountain, and all kinds of tea, liquor, snacks, flowers, and pets were sold at this place. There was everything that one could wish for. In fact, many children in the small town would be ecstatic when they heard that their parents were going to the mountains to offer incense. They would almost be as happy as they were during the New Year. This was because there were fragrant and fresh pancakes with meat fillings, old men making miniature clay figurines, and so on. The New Year's money of many children would secretly accompany them to this marketplace. After having heaps of fun there, the children would often be severely reprimanded and punished by their parents after returning home. A young boy called Dong Xuejing also owned a stall here. He only sold wontons. Shrimp, spring bamboo shoots, and tofu were all incredibly flavorful. After sprinkling on some chopped spring onions and adding a bit of his homemade chili sauce, the wontons would truly be as delicious as could be. The young boy had initially been studying at the new private school set up by the Dragon Tail Creek Chun clan. However, he had suddenly dropped out of school for some unknown reason, even though it was free. He sold one of the 2 old estates in the small town, and he used the money to purchase large new estates in the new prefectural city. The new estate was only a few kilometers from Cool Wind Mountain. His wonton shop would open from early morning until evening, and there wouldn't be a fixed closing time. As long as there were still customers, Dong Xuejing would wait for them to finish eating no matter how late it was. Only after that would he pack up his stall and wheel it home. There was no longer a night curfew in the prefectural city, so there were bustling scenes and big crowds everywhere one went. If one gazed at the prefectural city from the mountain god temple atop Cool Wind Mountain at nighttime, it would seem as if there were countless large lanterns resting on the land. On this night, the tall and solidly built young boy was already preparing to pack up his wonton stall. He was about to return home. However, a strange man unexpectedly walked over from the distance. He seemed to be a swordsman, but his sword wasn't by his hip or on his back. It was hung by his belt behind his back. He walked over to the stall and asked with a smile, "Stall boss, are you still selling wontons?" Dong Xuejing grinned and replied, "Yes, of course. However, I need to boil some water first. Please wait for a while." The man smiled and sat down beside a table. The table was wiped clean, without a single stain or drop of oil on it. There was also a handmade bamboo holder filled with long and slender bamboo chopsticks. As it turned out, this young stall owner was also a dexterous craftsman. The man received a large bowl of steaming wontons. There were spring onions floating on top of the red soup, and just the look of them was enticing and mouth-watering. Dong Xuejing asked him if he could eat spicy food, and the man replied that the spicier the better. Hearing this, the young boy handed him a large plate of chili sauce. The man grabbed a pair of chopsticks. He was in no hurry to eat, and he lowered his head and closed his eyes to take in the fragrance of the wontons first. He clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "This is the smell." He then casually asked, "Do you know about the Mahist sect?" Dong Xuejing nodded and replied, "Of course I do. My teacher mentioned them before. He said that the Mahist teaching used to be one of the 4 great teachings. As such, the Mahist teaching is naturally very impressive. However, learning Mahist theory is difficult, and abiding by Mahist principles is even more difficult. This is a huge test of one's character. Moreover, there's also a bigger risk of splitting hairs and going down dead ends." Teacher described the Mahist sect as kind of adorable. Dong Xuejing scratched his head upon saying this. There was an innocent smile on his face, and he added, "It was my teacher who said this." The man chewed on a wonton and earnestly nodded. "Such a good description." He then asked, "Then have you heard about the saber-lending cultivators? When among traveling Mahist cultivators before?" Dong Xuejing shook his head with a blank expression. Mr. Qi had never mentioned this before. The man put down his chopsticks and patted his belly. He exhaled heavily and appeared extremely relaxed at this moment. He smiled and asked, "Then do you want to become a saber-lending cultivator?" Dong Xuejing's pupils contracted slightly, but they quickly returned to normal. He smiled and shook his head, replying, "Selling wontons is quite good. I can make money, and it's also very peaceful. Back then, he, Li Baoping, Lin Shui, Li Huai, and Shi Chuanjia, 5 students from the private school, had tricked the driver of the horse carriage who was actually a spy from the Great Li Empire. Even though Li Baoping and Lin Shui had come up with the plan, all of them had been forced to give a perfect performance. Otherwise, all of their efforts would have been wasted if someone had slipped up. Naturally, none of these 5 children who had eventually become Qi Jingquan's direct disciples were simple people. Take, for example, Dong Xuejing. He was still young, but he was already smart enough to seek out Ruan Xiu and ask her to sell the old estate in the small town for him. After selling it for an exorbitant price, he quickly went to the prefectural city to buy large new estates. He didn't buy a single estate, but an entire street. Money had fallen from the sky, and there were many ways to use this money. One could use money to earn more money. When it came to small amounts of money used for survival, however, it was a different matter altogether. In this case, a penny saved was a penny earned. These 2 ideas didn't conflict with each other. The man waved his hand and said with a faint smile, "Don't be in a hurry to answer this question. If you're wondering why I'm choosing you, Dong Xuejing, I've already observed you for quite a long time. You're not the best in each area, but you don't have any issues in any area either. This is already good enough." Dong Xuejing felt slightly exasperated, and he asked, "You are?" The man didn't conceal his identity. "My name is Su Ruo, and I'm a Mahis disciple from Middle-earth Divine Continent. I'm naturally not a saber-lending cultivator, but a very good friend of mine asked me to promise him something before he died. He asked me to find a suitable disciple for him, one that could inherit his lineage. He was the previous patriarch of the saber-lending cultivators in Mahis sect, and he was a very powerful person. He drank with Aoyang many times, and he paid for the wine every time. While Aoyang was traveling around Middle-earth Divine Continent, Aoyang left a trail of debt in his wake. It was again this good friend of mine who helped pay them off." "Who's Aoyang?" the young boy asked. "The son of the mortal enemy of your teacher's teacher," Su Ruo replied. Dong Xuejing was completely stupefied. What in the world was going on? Su Ruo stood up and said, "I'll visit again later. Have a good think about what I said." "Hang on a second," Dong Xuejing suddenly called. The man smiled faintly and said, "I'll put this bowl of wonton on credit first. Perhaps when you agree to become a saber-lending cultivator in the future." "How can I accept this? Since I'm doing business, even brothers should keep clear accounts," Dong Xuejing insisted. Su Ruo nodded and took out a few copper coins, saying, "Haha, you truly have the temperament of a saber-lending cultivator." He strode away under the soft glow of sunset. Dong Xuejing sat down and looked at the disappearing figure of the traveling Mahist cultivator. He raised an arm and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He hadn't mustered his courage to ask for the copper coins because he was stubborn and pedantic. Dong Xuejing wasn't a naive and rash person. Instead, he had done this to probe the character of the man in a very crude and basic manner. Dong Xuejing quietly sat beside the table in a daze. He was motionless, and he didn't feel a sense of wild joy as if a huge fortune had descended from the heavens. He was instead feeling a little lost. The young boy didn't kind of feeling. In reality, he wasn't a very ambitious person. He simply wanted to earn some money to guarantee himself a comfortable life with enough clothes and food. He wanted a well in his estate, and he wanted a willow tree next to this well. Each spring, he hoped to see tender green shoots sprouting from the willow tree. When the breeze blew over, he wanted to see the willow branches swaying back and forth. This would be very adorable. It was a secluded place, and it was also a dark and windy night. This was the best time to kill people and steal goods. At the same time, it was also the best time to slay demons and eliminate fiends. The outcome was dependent on who was more powerful. Were the cultivators more skilled, or were the demons more vicious? Pleasant chatter and silvery laughter traveled over to the rundown temple in Water-Combing Nation. In the end, there was knocking on the front door. The big-bearded martial artist glanced at Chun Ping'an and Zhang Shanfeng before teasing. "Which of you is going to open the door to welcome our guests? If I go, I'm afraid that I'll frighten these female spirits. At that time, what will we do if they turn around and flee without saying a word?" Zhang Shanfeng patted his chest and said, "This Taoist priest is slightly more handsome than Qin Ping'an, so..." Lu Qiqing was woken up by the chiming of the demon-detecting bell, and he was still muddle-headed and barely awake. Upon hearing the phrase, female spirits, he immediately thought of the fox spirits and beautiful ghosts from the supernatural tales. This instantly filled him with courage, and he hurriedly crawled up and shouted, "I'll go, I'll go. The ghosts and spirits from the tales are most fond of feeble scholars like me. All 3 of you are carrying sabers and swords, so I'm definitely the most suitable candidate since I'm unarmed. However, let me say this first. If we encounter good spirits, then let's treat them in a friendly manner. If they're willing to spend a lovely night with me, then don't try to stop me from accompanying them. If we encounter bad fiends who want to eat our livers, however, then you guys have to save me. Lu Qiqing giddily ran over to open the door. A strong gust of wind whooshed in, slamming into the scholar and forcing him to close his eyes. Afterward, he felt a fragrance waft past him as two silvery voices sounded beside him. A silk sleeve brushed over his face as well, and it felt incredibly delicate and smooth. Lu Qiqing was slightly intoxicated. He hurriedly closed the door. When the mountain wind finally subsided, he turned around and saw three beautiful women. Two of them smiled sweetly and ran toward the campfire where Xianxia and the others were sitting. Their figures were shapely, and just looking at them from behind caused Lu Qiqing's heart to flutter. There was also a slightly younger woman, and she was dressed in a light pink dress and wearing a pair of embroidered satin shoes. She timidly stood in front of Lu Qiqing and nervously pinched her dress with her fingers. Compared to her bold and beautiful big sisters, Lu Qiqing found her to be especially adorable and attractive. The big-bearded martial artist was sitting cross-legged and drinking wine. The two bold women walked over, and their low-cut collars revealed large swathes of their delicate white skin. The bashful Taoist priest flushed a slight shade of red when he saw this. Meanwhile, Chun Ping'an was attending to the campfire. He shifted the branches around. The young woman in the light pink dress didn't join in on the conversations. Instead, she squatted in front of the campfire by herself. Her head was lowered, and she reached her hands over to warm them up. Lu Qiqing sat down beside her and actively tried to get familiar with her, asking with a smile, "Young miss, are you and your sisters from Watercombing Nation?" The young woman nodded in reply. She looked up with trembling eyelashes, and she looked like she wanted to speak. However, she couldn't help but hesitate. The big-bearded martial artist shot a sideways glance at the young woman's embroidered satin shoes. He then looked at the two seductive women and chuckled. Apart from the small amount of dirt on her feet, how did you both manage to remain so spotless after traveling across so many mountain paths? You're not mountain ghosts and spirits, are you? If that's the case, then the four of us are truly in big trouble. When the time comes, we'll have no option but to beg the two of you for a quick and painless death. However, dying at the hands of two beautiful women is also a fairly elegant fate. Hehe, what do you say, big sisters? Lu Qiqing chuckled and remarked. These two big sisters are so stunningly beautiful, so how can they possibly be ghosts or spirits? Appearances are born from the mind, so this is simply impossible. Taking 10,000 steps back, even if these two big sisters are truly ghosts, they're definitely good ghosts who only perform good deeds. Why don't we recite poems and drink tonight? Even though yin and yang have different paths, this chance encounter between humans and ghosts is still worth some celebration and drinks. Only that will make this an elegant and refined encounter. Isn't that right, big sisters? When we drink in a while, please don't reveal your ghostly attributes by accident. Otherwise, that will ruin the beauty of the moment. The two enchanting women exchanged a smile. They had hunted people for 100 or so years here, yet this was the first time they had come across such a simple-minded person. Was he daring because of his incredible power? Or was he naive because of his inexperience? Perhaps he was completely oblivious to the viciousness of ghosts and fiends in the mountains and rivers? One of them covered their mouth and giggled, while one of them directly clutched their stomach and chortled with laughter. Her body rocked back and forth, causing her breasts to bounce up and down. Standing opposite her, Lu Qiqing gulped when he saw this. The young woman suddenly looked up with a deathly pale face and shrieked, "Hurry up and run! There!" The beautiful woman covering her mouth and giggling suddenly became serious. She lashed out with a hand, striking the young woman's forehead and causing her to collapse backward onto the ground. There was a bright red welt on her forehead. Lu Qiqing was given a huge fright. At almost exactly the same time, Zhang Shanfeng put two fingers together to form a sword seal. The peach-wood sword on his back instantly flew out, rapidly drawing an arc in the air before directly piercing the back of the beautiful woman who had lashed out. The beautiful woman collapsed to the ground after being stabbed by the peach-wood sword. However, no blood flowed from her body, and it was as if the peach-wood sword shrouded in spiritual light had simply pierced into empty clothes. The woman's face and body contorted severely. It was clear that she wasn't a spirit who had cultivated a human form. Instead, she was a ghost or a similar entity who didn't possess a physical body. Black smoke rose from the female ghost, and she continued to struggle in an attempt to flee from this area. However, she couldn't break free from the restriction of the peach-wood sword that was impaled into the ground no matter what. It was as if she were a chained beast. Feng recited a spell, causing the spiritual glow on the peach-wood sword to become increasingly brilliant. The female ghost was no longer able to maintain her human form. A flash of saber aura blasted over. As it turned out, the big-bearded martial artist had also drawn his saber in a ferocious manner. His saber slashed through the flames of the campfire, and countless streams of fire danced across his blade like soaring fire dragons. He was like an immortal tempering his divine weapon. Xianxia slashed down, obliterating all of the black smoke formed by the female ghost, whose soul had been ensnared by Zhang Shanfeng's peach-wood sword. The black smoke immediately dissolved upon coming into contact with the saber brimming with a powerful aura. The female ghost's ear-piercing shrieks of agony echoed throughout the old temple. Xianxia turned around, and was left feeling slightly ashamed by what he saw. Chun Ping'an was holding the neck of the female ghost in one hand and punching her in the gut with the other. The female ghost was already in a dire state, with little black smoke remaining in her body. They had both annihilated a female ghost, but Chun Ping'an's actions were truly silent and deadly. He was ruthless, and he was showing no mercy even towards such a beautiful woman. Lu Qiqing wasn't stupid, and he had no time to worry about protecting the beautiful young woman. He was on the verge of wetting himself as he ran away from the young woman and navigated around the campfire, eventually arriving behind Chun Ping'an and the others. The young woman struggled to sit up, and she was close to tears as she sobbed, "Hurry up and run, our mama, one, will arrive soon." Just as she finished speaking, the demon-detecting bell shook violently again. A strong gust of wind blasted the door open, and a wisp of chilly mountain wind directly slammed into the young woman's back, causing her to spit blood. Her slender body was sent flying past the campfire, and she was forced to stumble toward the young Taoist priest and the big-bearded martial artist. Xianxia hurriedly put his saber away, lest he injure the innocent young woman. However, a sly smile suddenly spread across the young woman's face at this moment. Her hands shot forward and jabbed at Xianxia and Zhang Shanfeng's chests several times. While doing this, she also borrowed the opposing momentum to jump back slightly and land in the fire. She used her embroidered satin shoes to play around with the raging flames, yet the scorching hot firewood and the flickering flames were unable to injure her at all. She paid no more heed to the frozen Taoist priest and martial artist. However, she stepped forward to kick the peach-wood sword and send it flying away. A faint black scorch mark appeared on her embroidered satin shoe when it came into contact with the wooden sword. The young woman peered down and focused her gaze on the young boy, the only person who could still fight. There was an amused smile on her face, and she said, "If you're willing to flee, then I can allow you to go free." Gusts of cold and eerie wind howled past the door. At the same time, several men and women with ghostly auras materialized and looked toward the young woman inside the temple with fervent expressions. There were black banners in their hands, and they loudly exclaimed, "Mama's powers are unparalleled and everlasting." Chun Ping'an stood up straight and asked, "Are you a human or a ghost?" The so-called Mama, who was in the form of a young woman, smiled eerily and replied, "The human heart is full of evil ghosts. The human heart comes first, and the evil ghosts come later. From this, the human heart is slightly more terrifying. I've lived in this place in Watercombing Nation for 200 years, and my specialty dish after all these years is called the stir-fry heart. The heart must be freshly plucked, and I also need to add lots of spices. Otherwise, the heart will taste too earthy, and who likes that? However, there are also some exceptions. An old Taoist priest passed by this place a few years ago, and he managed to kill a few obedient maidservants of mine with his powerful cultivation. That Taoist priest had a top-notch heart. It was a rare delicacy. The four of you are also quite powerful, so I wonder what your hearts will taste like. I suppose they won't taste too bad. After all, the physiques and souls of cultivators are ultimately superior to those of mortals." Suddenly, someplace extremely far away from the old temple, the voice of an old man clearly echoed, "A suitable day for swinging a sword, isn't it?" The young woman's expression changed drastically. Flashes of sword light burst across the front door, separating the heads of the ghosts and entities from their bodies. Naturally, being beheaded meant nothing whatsoever to a ghost. However, these ghosts and entities who dominated the region appeared as weak as mortals under the attacks of the sword light. After being beheaded, they had no chance of recovering and surviving. It wasn't long before an old man in black stepped through the door. His expression was plain, and an empty sword scabbard was hanging by his waist. Meanwhile, an unsheathed sword floated beside him. Its bronze blade was filled with cracks, and there wasn't a single lick of sword chi or spiritual light flowing over it. However, the rusty sword still radiated a formless might as it quietly hovered beside the old man. Pure sword chi, brimming sword intent, and fearsome sword skills. When traveling around the world, there would always be a taller mountain too. The young woman was clearly aware of this old man's identity. Her fingernails became as long as hooks, and she arched her back as she stared at the old man in black. Song Yuxiao, as someone from the cultivation world, are you truly going to make enemies of the 4 evil spirits of Water-Combing Nation? She shouted. Are you not afraid of us joining forces to destroy your Swordwater Villa? The old man remained calm and unfazed as he looked at the powerful and notorious demonic cultivator from Water-Combing Nation. Hearing this threat, which was nothing more than the ghost trying to look tough, he simply tilted his head. There was a dark expression on the face of the female fiend who looked like a young woman. Song Yuxiao, do you insist on fighting with me today? The old man in black fished out an old almanac from his robes. He flipped to a certain page and placed his finger somewhere, murmuring to himself, a suitable day for fasting, a suitable day for seeking wealth. Song Yuxiao put the almanac away and returned his ancient bronze sword to its scabbard. He extended a hand toward the young woman and said, I'll allow you to sacrifice wealth to avert calamity. The young woman was well aware of this strange old man's rules, so she immediately retrieved a yellow jade copper coin from her sleeve. The characters End of Plum Rain and Beginning of Scorching Summer were engraved on its front side, and the characters Thunder Rumbling Across Heaven's Peak were engraved on its backside. These types of jade coins were similar to snowflake coins, in the sense that both were currencies used by immortals from the mountains. The jade coin in the young woman's hand was commonly known as a lesser heat coin 1. Lesser heat coins were far more valuable than snowflake coins. The difference between the two was like the difference between silvertails and copper coins. She lightly tossed the lesser heat coin towards Song Yuxiao. However, she didn't make any more threats. She instead smiled sweetly and said, It was through blows that we became acquainted with each other. So I hope you won't turn me away when I visit your Swordwater Villa in the future. The old man in black was expressionless as he caught the lesser heat coin and put it away. He made no attempt to stop the young woman as she transformed into a cloud of blackish-green smoke and slowly drifted away from the abandoned temple. The sword grandmaster called Song Yuxiao flicked his fingers and released several wisps of arrow-like wind, striking several acupoints on the chests of Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng. The two of them had been tricked and immobilized by the female fiend just then, and with their acupoint seals, they were unable to move or speak. Given enough time, they could have broken through these seals by themselves. However, until that happened, Chun Ping'an would have been forced to fight against the young woman by himself. This was the first time Zhang Shanfeng had experienced the acupoint sealing techniques of an elite cultivator from outside the mountains. He started to breathe deeply, trying to get rid of the strong sense of discomfort he was feeling. Su Yuanxia was a top-notch pure martial artist to begin with, so he couldn't help but flush bright red with embarrassment after suffering this major slip-up. He cupped his fists at the old man and said, Thank you for your help, Sword Saint Song. The old man in black was an eccentric person, and he completely ignored the big-bearded martial artist's words of gratitude. He directly walked over to the campfire and sat down with his legs crossed. He placed his sword across his knees and closed his eyes to rest. Upon seeing this, Su Yuanxia lowered his voice and roughly explained Song Yuxiao's background to Zhang Shanfeng and Chen Ping'an. In the central region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, actually in the dozen or so nations near Colorful Garment Nation, there were 4 sword grandmasters extremely well-renowned. There was a sword god in Colorful Garment Nation, but he had already left the cultivation world and lived in seclusion in the mountains for 30-odd years. People praised his sword skills as godly, and his sword was called Illuminating Sunday. However, a nightmarish piece of news had spread around lately, claiming that the old sword god had died at the hands of someone seeking vengeance. This had sent tumultuous waves through the surrounding cultivation world. Everyone was feeling uneasy. Then there was the old man in black sitting in front of them right now. He was the previous villa master of Water-Combing Nation's Swordwater Villa, and someone with a very strange temperament. He was 1 generation younger than Colorful Garment Nation's sword god, and he enjoyed the honorable title of Sword Saint. His sword was called Iron Water. He was also the founder of Swordwater Villa, the largest force outside the mountains in Water-Combing Nation. The current villa master was his eldest grandson, someone who was also very impressive with the sword. Meanwhile, an extremely famous sword paragon had burst onto the scene in ancient Elm Nation. He possessed incredible destructive power, but his martial ethics were truly as terrible as could be. He was a wandering cultivator with no permanent residence, and he hadn't founded his own force either. He always traveled around by himself. However, it was rumored that he had a fairly good relationship with the Emperor of ancient Elm Nation. His sword was called Green Jewel. Finally, there was the youngest prodigy from Pine Stream Nation. This person had given himself the title Green Bamboo Sword Immortal. These 4 sword grandmasters were like dazzling stars shining brightly in the skies above colorful Garment Nation and the dozen or so surrounding nations. Even the immortal forces from the mountains didn't dare to underestimate them. Song Yushao suddenly opened his eyes and chuckled coldly, saying, "Stop sneaking around. Show yourself." The old man venerated as a sword saint drew his bronze sword and casually slashed down in the direction of the deity altar in the temple. A wave of dazzling sword chi suddenly burst forth and completely annihilated the already decrepit deity altar. A pretty but skinny young girl was revealed. Her hands were wrapped around her head, as if to protect herself. When this strange young girl appeared, Zhang Shanfeng's demon-detecting bell started to softly chime again. When it came to the cultivation methods of spirits, demons, ghosts, and entities, almost all of them were unorthodox and heretical. If these beings didn't possess a powerful cultivation base, they would often be easily detected by demon-detecting bells. It was because of this that demon-detecting bells were a necessity for chi refiners, with only the Bai Zhe album being superior to it. They were highly valued and used by everyone. Before advancing to the 4th tier of martial arts, Su Yuanxia had also possessed a similar demon-detecting bell as a form of defense and warning. Right now, most of Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng's attention was focused on the young girl. Meanwhile, Chun Pingyan was amazed by the old man's sword strike. The young boy also wanted to practice the sword, but he was still unable to find the figurative entrance to this path. Song Yushao's sword strike appeared casual and relaxed, and he had seemingly unleashed a huge wave of sword chi with a simple sweep of his arm. The wave of sword chi was unstoppable, and it was like a thundering waterfall crushing everything in its path. Lu Qiqing had become abnormally quiet after the female fiend had lashed out at them. He was squatting beside the campfire and silently warming his hands with his head lowered. "This is a pure Buddhist temple, so how can measly demons like you be allowed to sully it?" There was a cold and stiff expression on Song Yushao's face as he flicked his wrist. The tip of his bronze sword shuddered slightly, instantly releasing a blinding white ray that looked like the demon-binding chains used by immortals from the mountains. Its wavy form quickly spread apart in midair, transforming into a large net as it descended toward the frightened young girl who had been categorized as a demon. It was as if she were being hunted by a vast net of laws brimming with heavenly Tao. This was truly an eye-opening experience for Chen Pingyan. Sword chi should have been concentrated and meticulous, yet it could also be manipulated and transformed. The old man was carefree and confident as he wielded his bronze sword with a single hand. Chun Pingyan was most fascinated by Song Yushao's calm and composed demeanor. This was something that he longed for. There were crackling sounds as the net of sword chi landed on the young girl. She writhed around in pain on the floor, and the bone-piercing pain caused by the scorching sword chi was already beginning to damage the depths of her soul. Back then, Chun Pingyan had also experienced torturous pain in the bamboo building on Downtrodden Mountain. However, this time the victim was a minor demon lax with cultivation and never competed with others. A short moment passed, and the young girl was no longer able to maintain her human form after being struck by the sword saint's attack. Half of her face reverted to that of a fox's, and tufts of white fur also appeared on her neck and the back of her hands. A faint foxy smell wafted through the air. The snow-white fox spirit with a weak cultivation base struggled and wailed, "I've never hurt anyone before. I've never hurt a single person before. I've only pranked and frightened some scholars who seek shelter in this old temple. Don't kill me. Don't kill me." There was seemingly a knot in the old man's heart as he held his bronze sword brimming with sword chi and glowing with sword light. "Demons are demons, and fiends are fiends," he exclaimed in a stern voice. "So what if you haven't hurt people before? Once your cultivation improves, you'll naturally start to kill innocent people for fun." Half of the young girl's body had already reverted to her original fox form. She prostrated herself on the ground and said through labored breaths, "I even rescued 2 scholars from the hands of that mama. I had to give her some items that I'd been treasuring for a long time in order to do this, and only then was she willing to release the scholars. I'll never hurt anyone. I'll never hurt anyone in my life. A measly fox spirit like you deserves nothing but death." The old man in black sneered. "I dare say that I'll only kill 1 innocent being at most out of 100. The young fox spirit was already too weak to say anything else. Her clothes were tattered, and her bloodied body convulsed on the ground. Her bright black eyes had been especially lively before, but they were already dim and lusterless at this moment. As she died, she didn't feel hatred toward the old man for being ruthless and unreasonable. Instead, she dazedly looked toward the door of the temple, as if she were waiting for an impoverished scholar to arrive. It was as if she were waiting for someone to prank and scare. Succeeding one time could make her feel happy for several months. Lu Qiqing slowly looked up. A hint of golden light flowed in his profound eyes, and there was also a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. A resigned sigh escaped his lips, one that reflected his familiarity and experience with worldly affairs. He felt like the world would still be as uninteresting as always even if another 1,000 years passed. Just as Lu Qiqing was about to stand up, Chen Pingyan stood up and adjusted the sword case on his back. Senior Song, what if this fox spirit is the one innocent being? What will you do then? He suddenly asked. The old man pursed his lips before replying with a smile. Then that's perfect. It will guarantee that the previous 99 and subsequent 99 beings that I kill will be demons and fiends causing trouble for the common people. Knowing this, my sword strikes will become even faster and more resolute. Chen Pingyan pointed at the young girl who had completely reverted back to her original fox form already. Then what about her? Song Yushao patted his chest and replied in a blunt voice. If my old almanac says that today is suitable for burying people, then I'll bury her after killing her. If not, then I'll leave her corpse exposed to the elements. She can pray to reincarnate into something better in her next life, and hope that she doesn't become a demon or fiend again. Of course, it's more important for her to pray that she doesn't come across me again. Chen Pingyan was slightly stubborn, and he said, it's naturally correct for Senior to slay demons and subdue fiends. However, you can do even better. The old man carefully observed the young boy with the sword case. He suddenly chuckled and said, Little boy, are you an idiot? You're simply seeking shelter in an old temple, yet you're actually treating yourself as a benevolent bodhisattva liberating people from suffering now. Chen Pingyan hesitated for a moment before asking, Senior Song, under what condition will you let this fox spirit go? Song Yushao stood up and replied in a solemn voice, Little boy, seeing that you're also a swordsman roaming the cultivation world, I can use my killing blow for her against you instead. If you can block my strike, then I'll let the matters in this old temple slide. Regardless of whether this fox spirit commits sins or performs good deeds in the future, you'll be the one to bear the karmic fate. If you fail to block my strike and die by my hands, however, then you can only blame yourself for being too weak to stand up for others. What do you say? Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng both stood up. It was as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Song Yushao roared with laughter. I don't mind if the two of you want to interfere as well. After all, I simply need to launch 2 more sword strikes. The rules will be the same. His laughter was loud and sonorous. In fact, it was filled with so much energy that even the decaying beams in the temple started to shudder, causing countless plumes of dust to float through the air. I accept, Chen Pingyan said with a nod. He then shook his head at Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng, signaling for them not to interfere. The old man was a direct person, and he immediately launched a sword strike after giving a warning. There were only 3 meters between them, and the sword ray and astral energy of the strike instantly arrived in front of Chen Pingyan. An inch movement talisman had already slid out from the young boy's sleeve. The talisman was made from ordinary yellow paper, and it was resting between his fingers. Chen Pingyan vanished from the spot the instant that the sword chi neared him. The old man in black snickered upon seeing this. As it turned out, the burst of sword chi was continuing to surge forward after failing to strike Chen Pingyan. Its target was coincidentally the snow-white fox spirit that was curled up on the ground. The inch movement talisman was from the authentic death-avoiding book that Li Shixing had given Chen Pingyan, and it was truly a mystical and mysterious talisman. However, it was a consumable item that could only be used a single time. After activating it, Chen Pingyan immediately reappeared 6 meters away from his original spot. However, when he discovered the burst of sword chi bearing down on the fox spirit, it was already too late for him to retrieve and use another inch movement talisman. As a result, he had no option but to physically lunge over. At the same time, he reached toward his shoulder and gripped the hilt of eliminating fiends, his locust wood sword. He slashed toward the burst of sword chi. Even though he was launching a sword strike, Chen Pingyan was fundamentally using a fist technique rather than a sword technique. He was using the fearsome heavy cavalry formation shattering technique that Cui Chan's grandfather had taught him. However, he was unleashing this technique using his locust wood sword instead of his fists. Chen Pingyan's physique and soul were both only at the 3rd tier of martial arts, and he was nowhere near the level of a superior grandmaster who could adeptly fuse fist techniques and sword intents together. Because of this, his hurried sword strike would appear especially awkward in the eyes of genuine sword cultivators. The sword strike imbued with fist intent crashed into the burst of sword chi unleashed by Song Yushao, forcefully stopping it from killing the young fox spirit. Sword light erupted into the surroundings, and sword chi blasted through the air. Holding the locust wood sword in his hand, Chen Pingyan stepped to the side and turned around, with his back at the fox spirit. He randomly swung his sword at the scattered sword chi, and his sword stance was entirely similar to the bastard fist technique that a certain young girl had teased him about before. Zhang Shanfeng breathed a sigh of relief. However, he could barely bring himself to watch on. The big-bearded martial artist slapped his forehead and said in helplessness, "His fist techniques were fairly impressive, so I initially thought he was a young swordsman with incredible hidden skills, especially since he's been carrying that sword case around for so long." After destroying all of the fragmented sword chi, Chun Ping'an hurriedly examined the locust wood sword in his hand. Even though it was a light wooden sword, it was surprisingly tough and durable. There wasn't a single scratch on the blade even after blocking the sword saint's tremendous sword strike. Chun Ping'an felt extremely relieved. There was a carefree smile on Song Yuxiao's face as he said in self-ridicule, "I never imagined that someone would use the bastard fist technique to block my sword strike. Well, no matter. I'll uphold my end of the promise. You managed to block my strike, so I won't target that fox spirit anymore. The two of you can take care of yourselves. However, karmic fate will always punish evildoers. So I hope the two of you will appreciate and remember the meaning of our encounter." The old man resheathed his sword. He had been sitting with his legs crossed the entire time, and he finally stood up to turn around and leave at this moment. He looked up at the gloomy night sky after exiting the temple, and he murmured to himself, "Too many demons and fiends to kill, and too many ghosts and spirits to kill. When will this all end?" Then he suddenly turned around and said with a smile, "The four of you can visit my villa if you're interested. The villa will host a meeting to elect an alliance leader for Water-Combing Nation's martial arts world soon, and this election can be viewed as a grand event in the cultivation world. I most likely won't be present when the four of you arrive at the Swordwater Villa, so you can directly look for Steward Chu, the oldest steward in the villa. Tell him that you're new friends I made while traveling around the cultivation world. At the very least, he'll treat you to some wine." Song Yuxiao then looked at Chun Ping'an and said, "Your patience to do something even better tonight was an attitude that I also possessed from my youth to middle age. In fact, I was even more steadfast than you. However, no, forget about it. These are just the disheartened grumblings of an old man, so it's best not to ramble on about them to a young boy. In any case, I hope you can persevere and maintain this attitude." The old man, already in his twilight years, patted the sword by his waist before silently vanishing into the distant darkness of night. Chun Ping'an was dazed for a long while. When he finally came to his senses, he turned around and couldn't help but widen his eyes. The young fox spirit had already disappeared at some point. The big-bearded martial artist pointed at his own face and teased, "Chun Ping'an, oh Chun Ping'an, when playing the role of a hero saving a beauty, this is the deciding factor regarding whether the beauty is willing to pledge herself to you." Chun Ping'an placed his locust wood sword back in the wooden sword case that Wei Bo had made for him. He jogged to the campfire and extended his hands toward it. At the same time, he caught sight of the yawning Lu Qiqing squatting opposite him. The young scholar grinned and asked, "What are you staring at? Are you finally envying my elegance and handsome appearance?" "Sigh. In fact, I envy you as well, Chun Ping'an. If I possessed half of your martial arts talent, I would have already become the dream man of hundreds upon thousands of female cultivators in the cultivation world." Chun Ping'an rolled his eyes. He grabbed the wine gourd from his waist and drank a large mouthful of wine. He held the wine gourd in his hand afterward, and the crashing waves in his mind were in stark contrast to his outwardly calm demeanor. Chun Ping'an hadn't used the two flying swords in his sword-nurturing gourd to block Song Yuxiao's powerful sword chi just then, and he had instead charged into danger by himself. However, he hadn't been acting rashly. He sighed and stood up, walking to an empty area where he retied the sword-nurturing gourd to his waist. He then closed his eyes and carefully replayed the 3 sword strikes of the sword saint in his mind. One strike had destroyed the deity altar and forced the fox spirit to show itself. One strike had transformed his sword chi into a net with a simple flick of his wrist, and one strike had flown at Chun Ping'an. With his eyes still closed, he took out his locust wood sword and emulated the old man's stance. He held his sword horizontally in front of his chest, as if he was preparing to draw it from a scabbard. For some reason, however, Chun Ping'an couldn't get the stance right no matter what. He felt like he wouldn't succeed even if he mulled over it and practiced it tens of thousands of times. To say nothing of achieving a similar demeanor or aura, he couldn't even achieve a similar physical stance. This was in stark contrast to his experience of learning the 6 steps walking meditation from Ningyao. As it turned out, sword techniques were fundamentally different from fist techniques. Chun Ping'an sighed and had no option but to put his locust wood sword away. This sword had accompanied him on 2 long journeys already. Someone smiled and remarked, "Chun Ping'an, your wooden sword is too light, so you won't be able to achieve the correct stance no matter what." Lifting something heavy as if lifting something light is a high-level skill in the sword Dao, and you're not some kind of supreme prodigy when it comes to practicing the sword. You're only an amateur. It's only natural for you to feel like something is off. Forget about reaching the peak. Let's just talk about learning the ropes. When it comes to fist techniques, having a somewhat skilled master to guide you is good enough. When it comes to sword techniques, however, one needs to have a truly sagacious teacher to guide them. You should have asked that Song Yushao for guidance. His cultivation isn't high, but he's already forged his own sword Dao. This is quite impressive. Chun Pingyan turned around to look over. These insights hadn't been offered by the big-bearded martial artist, and they hadn't been offered by the young Taoist priest who could manipulate his peach with sword either. Instead, they had been offered by Lu Qiqing, the impoverished scholar who was most removed from the cultivation world. While speaking, Lu Qiqing kept adding dry branches to the fire. Illuminated by the campfire, it was as if his slender body were gently swaying with the flames. Zhang Shanfeng was asking Su Yuanxia about acupoint sealing techniques, and the two of them were completely absorbed in their own conversation as one asked questions and one answered them. Neither of them paid much attention to Lu Qiqing's words. No, more accurately, neither of them heard Lu Qiqing's words at all. This was because Lu Qiqing hadn't opened his mouth to speak. However, Chun Pingyan had indeed heard Lu Qiqing's voice. Chun Pingyan asked a very strange question, saying, "Is it you? Back in Blusher Prefecture, I heard Prefectural Overseer Lu say in private that you're actually a Golden Core tier immortal. He knew this because you demonstrated your mystical powers outside the prefectural city." Lu Qiqing waved a hand and slowly made his way around the campfire, arriving beside Chun Pingyan. He chuckled and replied, "All right, let's stop targeting each other in secret, shall we? You already know that I'm a great demon, and I also know that the sword in your sword case has a very impressive background. Otherwise, it wouldn't have failed to suppress its own aura and started to buzz after sensing my aura just then. Even though you managed to forcefully suppress its movements very quickly, I'm not a blind or deaf person who's completely oblivious to my surroundings. Since we're both completely aware of each other's secrets now, can you tell me which sagely person forged the sword on your back? Chun Pingyan? Who in Stalactite Mountain are you delivering the sword to? Are you trying to snatch it?" Chun Pingyan asked with a solemn expression. The possessed Lu Qiqing smiled with squinted eyes, and it was as if he had just heard a hilarious joke. He clasped his hands behind his back and shook his head, saying with a smile, "It's an impressive sword, but I genuinely have no interest in it. I know you don't believe me, but this doesn't matter. I'm far more powerful than you, so you simply need to trust my actions if you don't trust my words." "Oh, that's right. Have you heard of this saying before? Beautiful things in the world are easily destroyed. Iridescent clouds soon disperse, and colored glaze soon shatters?" 1. Chun Pingyan nodded and replied, "I've read this line in a poem." Lu Qiqing flicked his sleeve, causing mist and smoke to swirl around them. However, things would appear completely normal if one looked over from the campfire. It would look like Lu Qiqing was having a delightful conversation with Chun Pingyan. In reality, the impoverished scholar from White Mountain Nation appeared extremely handsome and elegant as he stood there in his pink Taoist robe. This was a very uncanny sight. Iridescent clouds prone to dispersing refers to the iridescent clouds surrounding White Emperor City. Clouds gather and disperse like smoke there, creating a stunning spectacle. As for colored glaze prone to shattering, this refers to a great demon who originated from a demonic force in White Emperor City. Just like the conflict tonight, he got into an argument with his senior brother for the sake of an insignificant small demon. One was considering the great trend of the world, while one was considering the justice of the specific situation. The two sect brothers broke off relations because of this. Looking back on the matter now, it seems truly comical and no different from two children getting into an argument with each other. In any case, I smashed an entire colored glaze pagoda in White Emperor City out of anger, and only a few colored glaze bowls managed to survive. I left White Emperor City after that and started to travel around the world without the protection of my master's force. Afterward, I was hunted for tens of millions of kilometers by protectors of Tao and ultimately thrown into prison. I was suppressed there for 1,000 years. Meanwhile, my senior brother watched on without doing anything the entire time. "Why are you telling me all this?" Chun Pingyan asked with a frown. Lu Qiqing smiled faintly and shook his hands, causing the large sleeves of his pink Taoist robes to shudder slightly. He placed his hands over his abdomen and said in a serious manner, "Because I intend to take a disciple now. I feel like you, Chun Pingyan, are a fairly suitable candidate, and I can teach you the most supreme sword techniques in the world. Even though I'm a demon born in the majestic world, my senior brother is the leader of a demonic force, and he appears even more divine and immortal than immortals because of this. Thus, many powerful beings from immortal forces who have attained Tao are still willing to pay respects to him. In other words, the sword technique I'll teach you is an authentic one that will allow you to reach the pinnacle of the great Tao. Once you come across a destined fated opportunity, you'll have the chance to directly advance to the upper 5 tiers. You have to understand the weight behind the word authentic. This term can't be thrown around carelessly. Even though people like Song Yuxiao have discovered some of their own sword Tao true intent, the limited talent of this pure martial artist means that he'd only be able to guide you to the middle 5 tiers of sword cultivation. Chen Ping'an, what do you say? Do you want to become my disciple and cultivate the great Tao with me? And become a demon? Chen Ping'an retorted. The possessed Lu Qiqing smiled faintly and replied, in my view, the great Tao places before us a rugged and challenging path that only the most determined and resolved individuals can traverse and reach the end of. In fact, such kinds of individuals might be able to walk even higher and further than those supremely talented prodigies. You, Chen Ping'an, walk the same path as me. I've already recruited a senior brother for you, and you can rest assured that you'll be my final disciple. In at most 100 years, the 3 of us will definitely gain renown throughout the world. We'll return to White Emperor City and win an esteemed spot there. Lu Qiqing looked deep into Chen Ping'an's eyes and continued with a smile. My senior brother and I were in a very interesting force before. My senior brother was a human, yet he cultivated the techniques of demons. Meanwhile, I'm a demon, but I cultivated the techniques of humans. Our teacher had a motto, education without distinctions. In this sense, our teacher was very similar to True Invincible, the second disciple of the Tao ancestor. Apart from White Emperor City, there are several other large demonic orthodoxies in the world. They're all astonishingly powerful, and the relationship between them is also complicated and intertwined. Even immortal forces with the title of sect need to avoid direct conflict with these orthodoxies. From this, one can see that the distinction between demonic orthodoxies and other orthodoxies is nothing more than a joke. As long as one is powerful enough and possesses a high enough cultivation, these distinctions have no influence at all. Chen Ping'an grinned and said, before becoming your disciple, I need to ask my other teachers for their opinions. Beads of sweat had already formed on his forehead. Yet Chen Ping'an appeared completely calm and relaxed at this moment. Lu Qiqing's eyes lit up, and he remarked, I knew that you had impressive teachers. However, that doesn't matter. Why don't you tell me who they are? Assessing the situation and choosing the most powerful teacher to study under isn't embarrassing at all. I won't force you, and I won't frighten you with words either. If your teachers are superior to me, I definitely won't force you to become my disciple. The scholarly sage had most likely left Eastern treasured Vile Continent already, so where would Chen Ping'an find him? Mr. Qi had already passed away, so it was seemingly impossible to ask for his opinion as well. However, Chen Ping'an definitely didn't want to learn supreme great Taos or whatnot from this person. He took a deep breath and decided to take a gamble. Success or failure all depended on this gamble. If this didn't work, then he would simply fight with his life on the line again. If this still didn't work, then he would simply become the disciple of the possessed Lu Qiqing for the moment. Just like Aoyang had said, the heaven was great and the earth was great, but staying alive was the greatest of all. No matter what, he definitely had to deliver the sword to Stalactite Mountain and personally hand it over to Ningyao. Everything else was secondary. When Chen Ping'an had accompanied Li Baoping and the others to Great Sui Nation, and when he had returned to Yellow Court Nation with the young Cui Chan afterward, no one knew why he would always practice standing meditation when he reached the peak of mountains and the banks of rivers. Moreover, he would remain standing in the same spot for a long time even after he finished practicing standing meditation. Even though he was traveling around the world by himself now, he would still sit on the apex of roof ridges by himself. This was the case when he had farewelled Lu Gaoxin in the prefectural city of Blusher Prefecture. On the last day of spring, he had sat in the spring breeze and murmured to himself while drinking wine. During these times that others wouldn't think too deeply about, there would be spring breeze lingering around his sleeves. Deep down in his heart, Chen Ping'an knew that Mr. Qi had definitely passed away already. However, Mr. Qi had once told him something. If you encounter any problems in the future, you can pose your questions to the spring wind. Lu Qiqing couldn't help but happily chuckle. He felt was quite an interesting situation. He saw the young boy in front of him shaking his hands and causing his sleeves to flutter, exactly as he had done just then. However, the smile quickly vanished from Lu Qiqing's face. Chen Ping'an raised his hands and revealed the wisps of spring wind joyfully dancing around his sleeves. It was as if they were azure flood dragons swimming through the clouds. Mr. Qi, Chen Ping'an asked softly. Lu Qiqing's heart shuddered violently. At this moment, it was as if he had returned to that huge battle from 1,000 years ago. It was as if he were facing off against that heavenly master who had an immortal sword in one hand and a Taoist seal in his other. A warm and rich voice sounded beside Chen Ping'an. "I'm here." The pink Taoist robes of Lu Qiqing slowly fluttered in the light breeze. The supreme demonic cultivator from White Emperor City felt a rare sense of apprehension at this moment. This didn't make any sense. The wisps of spring wind had transformed into a figure beside Chen Ping'an. The figure was a Confucian scholar in azure robes and with white sideburns. He appeared intangible and had a faint smile on his face. Lu Qiqing observed his aura, and he determined that the scholar was already like a candle close to extinguishing. However, there was also an unexplainable feel about the scholar in addition to his feeble aura. If he were an upper 5 tiers chi refiner, he would most likely fail to understand the reason behind this. However, the great demon currently possessing Lu Qiqing's body had been a legitimate immortal tier cultivator during his peak, a 12th tier cultivator. Before betraying the demonic orthodoxy, he had seen far too many capable people and peculiar individuals in White Emperor City, a place that existed among iridescent clouds under the descending water from Yellow River Small World. These people stood at the pinnacle of the world and had caused him to feel restricted and reserved. The more he couldn't see through a person, the more he wouldn't dare to underestimate them. Qi Jingchun looked at Chen Ping'an and used his eyes to reassure the young boy. Standing beside the young boy, he smiled at Lu Qiqing and said, "I'm Qi Jingchun, a disciple of the scholarly sage and a previous mountain master of Mountain Cliff Academy." The possessed Lu Qiqing was slightly dazed. The person standing in front of him wasn't haughty or overbearing, and instead appeared very polite and pleasant. However, scholarly sage? Qi Jingchun? Mountain Cliff Academy? What were all of these random things? Perhaps 2 sagely Confucians had appeared during the 1,000 years he had been suppressed by Mount Longhu's heavenly master? Moreover, the title of scholarly sage wasn't simple at all. The suffix of sage implied that he had the right to possess a godly statue and be honored in the Confucian temples. Not only this, but his godly statue would be near the very front. For example, this was the case with the etiquette sage and the second sage. If anyone were to blame, it would be the half-assed scholar in Lu Qiqing. He was far too unknowledgeable, and he was always messing around with things not relevant to study. He wasn't interested in the situation of the continent. Instead, he liked to dream about using the pitiful amount of knowledge in his brain to woo women and enjoy wonderful times with them. Of course, his attitude also played a big part in this. He felt like Eastern Treasured Vile Continent was a barbaric land, so there would definitely be few cultivators at the upper 5 tiers even if they accumulated for another millennium. As such, he didn't need to pay any attention to this continent. Qi Jingchun casually flicked his sleeve, instantly dispersing the restriction formed by Lu Qiqing. Noble people treated others with sincerity. With the restriction gone, the big-bearded martial artist and the young Taoist priest quickly noticed the peculiar situation over there. They exchanged a glance with each other. Was the person wearing pink Taoist robes the impoverished scholar, Lu Qiqing? Why did he have such a strange fetish of dressing like a woman as well? And who was that senior scholar in azure Confucian robes? Lu Qiqing's eyes narrowed. This Confucian scholar had actually shattered his illusion technique in an instant. Even though his cultivation base could only rival half an unpolished jade tier cultivator at the moment, the profound mystical abilities passed down by the demonic orthodoxy of White Emperor City shouldn't have been so easy to shatter, even if his opponent were a chi refiner at the actual unpolished jade tier. Zhang Shanfeng was just about to stand up and walk over to Chen Ping'an. However, Xianxia immediately grabbed him by the elbow and warned in a quiet voice, "Let's finish our discussion here. We definitely can't get involved with the matters over there. It's best for us to ignore them completely." After saying this, the big-bearded martial artist saw the scholar in azure robes looking over and nodding at them with a smile. Xianxia hurriedly cupped his fists in reply. Qi Jingchun smiled and asked, "Senior, are you White Emperor City's colored glaze pagoda master?" Lu Qiqing nodded and replied in amusement, "What, you've heard of my great name before? Is it infamous and already known by everyone in Middle-earth Divine Continent?" Qi Jingchun shook his head and replied, "No, but I once traveled to the Yellow River and met the city lord of White Emperor City on the riverbank. He mentioned you during our conversation." Lu Qiqing suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse. "What absolute bullshit! My senior brother would never exit the city to greet others. With his temper, he'll never leave the city to welcome guests, even if they're Confucian sages personally heading over to visit him out of admiration. At most, he'll only show his face on the city wall amid the iridescent clouds. That would already be giving huge face to you Confucians. Yet, you're trying to tell me that you met him on the river bank? Good one, you stinky brat. You should have a bottom line even when you're bullshitting." Qi Jingchun couldn't help but chuckle and say, "The city lord even asked me to play 3 games of Go with him. However, I was busy at the time, and I needed to immediately return to a Confucian school. Because of this, I still owe him 3 games. Unexpectedly, I never had the opportunity to visit White Emperor City again after that. This is truly a regretful thing. Lu Qiqing raised his hands and forcefully rubbed his cheeks. There were flames of fury burning in his chest. Even though he had broken off with his senior brother, with no more relationship between them to speak of, he still felt respect toward the city lord of White Emperor City in the depths of his heart. This was a very pure feeling of respect and reverence. Thus, he was considering whether he should resolutely attack and destroy the last wisp of this person's damaged soul. Since the colored glaze pagoda master was unwilling to believe him, Qi Jingchun chose not to say anything else. In reality, Qi Jingchun didn't have a bad impression of this great demon from White Emperor City, who had returned to the world once again. The first time the great demon had developed killing intent was when the sword saint from Watercombing Nation had wanted to indiscriminately kill the young fox spirit. Among the many scholars who rambled on about morals and virtue, there was no shortage of hypocrites who acted in a sanctimonious manner. Among the many demonic cultivators, there was also no shortage of people who were distinguished and admirable. Qi Jingchun had traveled around the world with senior brothers several times before, so he had naturally come across many such examples. Thus, he wouldn't categorize people in a rigid manner based on their background. In any case, Qi Jingchun was well aware of the shattering colored glaze incident that had occurred in White Emperor City 1,000 years back. Thus, he actually felt a sense of approval toward the great demon standing in front of him. He patted Chen Ping'an's shoulder before smiling at Lu Qiqing and saying, "Chen Ping'an definitely can't become your disciple, senior. However, if you are still willing to teach sword techniques, and if Chen Ping'an is still willing to learn, then I'd be happy for that to happen." Lu Qiqing raised a finger and slowly wagged it left and right. "What situation are you in right now? Both of us are well aware of this. You're nothing more than a damaged wisp of soul formed by the condensation of some spring breeze. Even if you were a Confucian sage at the upper 5 tiers while you were alive, that was then and this is now. Do you think you have the ability to haggle with me?" Qi Jingchun glanced at the great demon dressed in a pink Taoist robe. He could see the killing intent radiating from Lu Qiqing. The great demon was itching to make a move. Members of the demon tribe were innately more reckless than calm, and it was often the case that they would follow their natural instinct of violence when making decisions. This led to many tragedies in the world. It wasn't unfounded for the majestic world to impose so many restrictions on great demons. Someone had once proposed the notion that members of a different species can't be trusted, and that demons and fiends are short-sighted beings who delight in robbing life force from others, with only human teaching encouraging people to sacrifice themselves for just causes. These opinions and remarks were extremely discriminatory toward non-human species. In reality, many sages from the 3 Confucian schools had suggested hunting down all great demons at the upper 5 tiers during the etiquette sage's reign over the majestic world. The sages had wanted to throw these great demons into jail and completely eliminate all future threats. However, the etiquette sage ultimately hadn't adopted this suggestion. Qi Jingchun sighed with slight emotion. At the end of the day, the reasoning of demonic beings all revolved around a single word: survival. They tirelessly pursued survival so that they could grow and become more powerful. By becoming more powerful, they could then act in an unrestrained and wanton manner. However, the reasoning of the majestic world revolved around rules and regulations. The majestic world would act within the boundaries of these rules and regulations to bestow favor upon its inhabitants. Qi Jingchun extended a hand and said with a smile, "If you don't want to speak reason and only want to use brute force, then I'll have no option but to borrow a sword and sever half of your cultivation." The long sword that Chen Ping'an had privately named Subduing Demons slowly slid out of its scabbard inside the locust wood sword case. It rang like a thirsty bird coming across water, and its aura soared into the sky. Lu Qiqing's pink Taoist robes swelled outward, and there was a look of violent rage in his eyes. A vast demonic aura coursed through his body as he chuckled and asked, "Are you sure you have the opportunity to grab that divine weapon that's been specially forged to target demons? Even if I can't obliterate your soul with a single punch, are you not afraid of me smashing Chen Ping'an into meat paste with a single punch?" Qi Jingchun was unfazed, as if he were expounding the most natural principle in the world as he replied, "As long as I remain in the world, no one will be able to harm a single hair of my junior brother." Lu Qiqing roared with laughter. "I don't believe this." However, his pupils suddenly contracted drastically. He was completely enveloped in a faint golden orb right now. However, an opening appeared in the orb above his head, and this was similar to the time when someone had slashed a gigantic hole into Yellow River Small World. The White Emperor City Chaos Origin golden light formation that was protecting Lu Qiqing was easily breached by an attack. What appeared at the start was a tiny black dot. However, This quickly transformed into a thin black line before rapidly expanding and eventually splitting the golden light formation in half. The tip of the sword was only an inch away from Lu Qiqing's glabella. Lu Qiqing was frozen still. Failing to make the first move didn't mean that he was helpless and defeated. Quite the contrary, in fact, as White Emperor City was renowned for its mastery of all kinds of mystical powers and techniques. Just his pink Taoist robe alone was a pseudo-immortal tool that could block Qi Jingchuan's sword strike without needing him to move. However, the long sword in the Confucian scholar's hand wasn't the sword forged by Ruanqiong. Instead, it was that basic locust wood sword. And thus, Lu Qiqing decided to retreat and relent because Qi Jingchuan wasn't intending to aggressively suppress him. In a sense, both parties were taking a step back. Qi Jingchuan slowly pulled back the wooden sword and returned it back to Chen Pingin's sword case. He smiled and remarked, "Things would have been completely different if Aoyang or senior brothers had unleashed this sword strike. Did my senior brother genuinely exit the city to meet you? And he even asked you to play 3 games of Go with him?" Lu Qiqing asked. Qi Jingchuan nodded in reply. This was the truth. He didn't need to feel proud about this, and he didn't need to conceal it either. In any case, Qi Jingchuan had never thought too much about these experiences. This was in stark contrast to the young Cui Chan, who was still feeling complacent and extremely pleased with himself after playing 10 games of Go with the city lord of White Emperor City. Lu Qiqing sighed in emotion. He appeared slightly adrift. It was as if a colored glaze bowl had shattered in his heart. He felt both disappointment and relief. In his mind, that haughty man was ultimately an invincible and flawless person. This was the case regardless of how resentful and furious he was toward his senior brother's heartlessness. Such a person shouldn't have made exceptions for anyone. Lu Qiqing was slightly disheartened as he said, "Since Chen Pingin and I can't become student and teacher, I won't teach him sword techniques anymore. My abilities aren't that cheap yet. Qi Jingchuan, since you're so capable, why don't you teach him by yourself?" He was seemingly a little sullen as he turned around and strode toward the entrance of the old temple. "Please wait for a moment. I have some words to offer you," Qi Jingchuan suddenly said. Lu Qiqing turned around with a puzzled expression. However, peculiar lights and spectacular colors suddenly rippled through his mind's lake. Astonishment and wild delight quickly spread over Lu Qiqing's face. He was filled with mixed emotions as he asked, "How very impressive, Qi Jingchuan. Someone as capable as you can be a paramount immortal standing at the peak of the mountains regardless of which world you go to. How have you fallen to such a miserable state?" "In what sense have I fallen?" Qi Jingchuan countered with a smile. Lu Qiqing faltered upon hearing this. He felt heartfelt admiration toward the Confucian scholar, and he replied, "I must concede my inferiority to you. We can count this as me owing a favor to Chen Pingin. When I regain my fame in Middle-earth Divine Continent in the future, Chen Pingin can come to White Emperor City to look for me." Before leaving the old temple, Lu Qiqing flicked his large sleeve and grabbed the young fox spirit hiding in a dark corner. He left the old temple with her. Just then, the young fox spirit had changed into brand new clothes and slapped several ounces of makeup onto her face. There were patches of red and green, and her appearance was as hilarious as could be. She had most likely mistaken this for the appearance of beautiful women. There was also a book in her robes, her favorite secret piece of reading that she always kept on herself. The book was called Talented Scholars and Beautiful Ladies, and it was badly printed and full of incorrect characters. In any case, this was a collection of romantic tales that also made some mentions of virtuous etiquette relevant to unmarried ladies from powerful clans. For example, they needed to speak in a gentle and soft manner, and had to lower their heads in a shy manner when they saw a handsome scholar for the first time. Afterward, they would need to timidly steal a glance before flushing red and lowering their head again. There were many profound principles. The young fox spirit learned many things from these tales. In fact, she would even shed tears time and time again when she read those tales with tragic endings. When Lu Qiqing forcefully grabbed her and took her away, she was initially given a huge fright. However, she immediately became happy again when she saw the handsome young boy standing outside the old temple. There was a red mark on his glabella and a willow branch in his hand. The young fox spirit felt like the heavens were truly kind to her. They had rewarded her with a handsome young boy whom she liked at first sight so soon. Lu Qiqing brought his disciple and the young fox spirit with him as he descended the mountain and headed off into the distance. Only he knew what his destination was. Qi Jingchuan looked around and also led Chen Pingin out of the old temple. They stood in the empty area outside the entrance and used the moonlight to gaze at the night scenery of the distant mountains. People have 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms. 1. The 3 immortal souls are embryo light, refreshing spirit, and serene essence. After I died, the fortunes of my souls and forms were mostly returned to this world. I also gave my disciples Li Baoping, Li Huai, and the other children the character Qi. As for you, Zhao Yao and Song Jisin, I secretly left a wisp of spring wind on 3 of you using the damaged remains of my 3 immortal souls. In fact, my current form can't be viewed as the complete Qi Jingchun. I can only be regarded as a Dao guardian who's accompanying you for a short period of time. Song Jisin's chosen path is becoming more and more distant from the Confucian orthodoxy. But this is simply the nature of worldly affairs. Each person has their own fate and destiny, and relationships can't be forced. Zhao Yao was obstructed by Cui Chan at the time, and the circumstances back then forced him to give up the seal with the characters, "The world welcomes spring." I had already predicted this, so I told Zhao Yao not to be overly worried about the fate of the seal. Afterward, Zhao Yao came across another fated opportunity during his journey to another continent. However, a slight flaw developed in his mind because of this. As his junior uncle in name, perhaps you'll need to help him once in the future. Chun Ping'an wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. Qi Jingchun smiled and said, "You want to say that you can't be regarded as my junior brother because you didn't agree to my teacher's proposal? That's all right. Even if you don't view the old scholar as your teacher, I still view you as my junior brother." Chun Ping'an scratched his head before nodding and replying, "Okay." Qi Jingchun patted the young boy's shoulder and asked, "Do you feel tired after walking all the way to the stage?" Chun Ping'an shook his head and replied, "No, it's been spectacular. Apart from practicing fist techniques, I've also been able to overcome all kinds of challenges and make all kinds of new friends like Brother Su and Zhang Shanfeng. In addition to this, I've also come across many spirits, gods, and ghosts. So, I don't feel tired." As if afraid that Mr. Qi wouldn't believe him, Chun Ping'an smiled and repeated, "I genuinely don't feel tired." Qi Jingchun nodded in response. He knew that the young boy was being honest in a sense, and he was indeed truly excited. However, how could he not feel tired after traveling such great distances and encountering so many troubles? He practiced uninteresting fist techniques day after day, and his frail shoulders also had to carry the burden of other people's expectations as well as the difficulties of the world. It was even more important for him to guard against the sinister nature of people's hearts. Thus, how could he not feel tired when dealing with people and challenges, all of which were unpredictable in nature? Chun Ping'an was carrying this heavy burden by himself, yet he was unwilling to have others worry about him. After realizing that Mr. Qi already knew everything, Chun Ping'an immediately blurted out his encounter with the mysterious mountain-crossing carp, his experiences in the flowing Cloudwater Alley in Yellow Court Nation, his encounters with Shun when in the City God Hall of Blusher Prefecture, and the city god's admiration toward Mr. Qi. Weibo, who had moved from Gotable Mountain to Clouddrape Mountain in the small town, the female ghost in the wedding dress with a strange temperament, the beautiful bone ghosts, and of course that man who wore a bamboo hat. Chun Ping'an talked about Aoyang the most, and he also mentioned Aoyang's dazzling smile whenever the swordsman talked about Mr. Qi. His face would scrunch up into a smile, yet he would also appear the saddest at these moments. In the end, Chun Ping'an chuckled and recounted how Aoyang had been punched down into the mortal world by a single punch from the Dao ancestor's second disciple. After reuniting, Aoyang had told him not to worry about practicing the sword yet, as practicing fist techniques to the pinnacle stage was already the same as practicing the sword. Thus, he wasn't feeling too worried at the moment. Qi Jingchun stood side by side with the young boy, who was rambling on about his experiences. He smiled and asked, "Do you miss Aoyang a lot?" Chun Ping'an looked up at the sky and murmured, "Aoyang will eventually return." He then turned to Mr. Qi and asked, "Right?" Qi Jingchun nodded with a smile. "Then what about you, Mr. Qi?" Chun Ping'an asked. Qi Jingchun sighed and shook his head. "After accompanying you for all this time, it will eventually be time for me to say goodbye. I've already done everything I can." Chun Ping'an lowered his head and silently stared at his feet. This reply hit Chun Ping'an the same way as Old Man Yang's reply of, "Wasn't worth it," back in the Yang family's medicine shop. Even though he expected it, it still made him feel very sad. He felt incredibly sad. Qi Jingchun reached over and gently placed a hand on the young boy's head. "Even though I said that my damaged soul is acting as Dao guardians for the 3 of you, is accumulating all of the spring wind here not a form of me asking you to travel around the world for me? I have no more regrets." He flashed Chun Ping'an a knowing smile and continued, "You can feel sad, but you can also drink wine, right?" The rims of Chun Ping'an's eyes were red as he grabbed the sword-nurturing gourd from his waist and handed it to Qi Jingchun. Qi Jingchun's figure was becoming increasingly faint, and he lazily stretched his back and shook his head with a smile. "You can save my portion for later." Chun Ping'an didn't drink any wine either, and he retied the gourd to his waist. He was afraid of genuinely becoming a drunkard. Chun Ping'an, do you want me to accompany you to practice the fist technique one last time? Qi Jingchun suddenly suggested. The 6-step walking meditation? Chun Ping'an asked in puzzlement. Qi Jingchun nodded in reply. Chun Ping'an took a deep breath before slowly walking forward and calmly throwing a punch. The moonlight was pure, and the Confucian scholar in azure robes walked beside Chun Ping'an and also threw a punch with him. His movements were also calm and leisurely. After finishing the 6-step walking meditation, Chun Ping'an came to a gentle stop and didn't repeat the fist technique anymore. He didn't turn around but instead gazed into the distance. Just like that. There was no more spring wind hovering around his sleeves. This time, Mr. Qi had truly left. Novel lunar logo. Novel lunar. Home. Browse. Genres. Search novels. Look in. Novel lunar logo. Novel lunar. Home. Latest updates. New novels. Completed. Hunking. Genres. Look in. / Sword of Coming. / Chapter 316. Chapter 316. October 29, 2025. Previous. 316. / 908. Next. Novel AI Studio. Explore our top 10. 000 plus free novels. Chun Ping'an returned to the old temple, where he was responsible for lookout duty for the second half of the night. Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng didn't ask him anything, so he didn't explain anything either. Chun Ping'an faced the campfire from late night until dawn, and the flickering flames illuminated his face, which seemed slightly less tanned than before. Nobody knew what he was thinking about. The first rays of sunshine were peeking over the horizon, and the big-bearded martial artist was still sleeping soundly. Meanwhile, Zhang Shanfeng folded his blankets and discovered that Chun Ping'an wasn't in the old temple anymore. He walked out and found that Chun Ping'an surprisingly wasn't practicing his fist techniques today. Instead, he was standing still with the locust-wood sword in his hand. Chun Ping'an turned around when he heard the young Taoist priest's footsteps. "You're awake." Zhang Shanfeng nodded and spread out his arms, stretching his body to loosen himself up. A morning breeze brushed through the mountains, still carrying with it a hint of chilliness. Zhang Shanfeng grabbed the peachwood sword from his back and started to practice his usual set of sword techniques. He twisted and turned, and his body followed the movements of the sword. He appeared light and nimble. Zhang Shanfeng had arms as long as a monkey's, and the transitions between his sword stances were also smooth and relaxed. From the perspective of cultivation elites outside the mountains, Zhang Shanfeng was a natural talent especially suited to practicing the sword. Of course, such a notion most likely didn't exist for cultivation forces in the mountains. These forces placed more emphasis on nurturing qi and refining qi, and all they wanted was to be able to advance through the cultivation tiers quickly enough. All they desired was massive cultivation speed, to the extent of leaving everyone else in the dust and stunning their elders. After Zhang Shanfeng finished practicing his sword techniques, Chun Ping'an was still standing there with the locust-wood sword in his hand. He was very hesitant and he couldn't launch a sword strike no matter what. During breakfast, the three of them had a discussion and decided to visit Song Yushao's Swordwater Villa together. They would rest there for a short while before asking around for the exact location of the ferry station in Watercombing Nation. Once they mapped everything out, they would then set off for their destination. Swordwater Villa was around 350 kilometers from here, and there were many towering mountains and majestic peaks on the way. Fortunately, the wind was calm and the sun was bright now that summer had arrived. Thus, the three of them could freely travel without too many worries. It wasn't long before they arrived near Swordwater Villa. The villa was located at the foot of an elegant-looking mountain. Before heading over, they passed through a bustling small town that seemed to have a continuous flow of visitors. Chun Ping'an bought some wine to fill his sword-nurturing gourd. Meanwhile, Su Yuanxia visited a bookstore and Zhang Shanfeng was responsible for replenishing their supply of dry food and dry meat. It was only during times of need that one would regret not having enough money. The big-bearded martial artist was interested in the sole copy of a book that had been left behind by the previous empire of the nation. It was in a very good state, but the price was also exorbitant. However, Su Yuanxia was helpless to do anything due to the lack of money in his possession. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel frustrated at his modesty back in Blusher Prefecture. He should have happily accepted the 5,000 taels of silver like Chun Ping'an. Sometimes, just a single copper coin short could become a huge and insurmountable obstruction, even for gallant heroes. Thus, the three of them continued to make their way towards Swordwater Villa. While walking over, Zhang Shanfeng mentioned a type of coin called grain rain coins. These coins were even more valuable than lesser heat coins, and Zhang Shanfeng said that he had never had the opportunity to see them before. He had only heard about these coins. 1 lesser heat coin was worth 1,000 snowflake coins, while 1 grain rain coin was worth 100 lesser heat coins. Earth immortals at the golden core tier or nascent tier seemingly all used this latter type of coin when purchasing and selling immortal treasures. Most importantly, grain rain coins could also double as a beneficial and nutritious item for chi refiners. A chi refiner could rapidly replenish their chi and vital energy by absorbing the energy from these coins. As they walked, Xianxia also reminded Chen Ping'an and Zhang Shanfeng about the treasures that they had obtained from killing the demonic cultivators in Blusher Prefecture. If these treasures weren't beneficial to their cultivation, then it was best that they sold them to the shops in the mountains. As long as the price wasn't too unreasonable, it made sense for them to sell them here. Using the money, they should then purchase 1 or 2 spirit tools that would benefit their current cultivation. After all, securing a useful spirit tool would be far more useful than keeping useless treasures. Just like how money was best spent on useful items, cultivation treasures were best exchanged for useful tools that could assist one's cultivation as well. Zhang Shanfeng had already thought about this before, and he replied that he wanted to buy a few offensive talismans that he had always dreamed of obtaining. It would be best if they were lightning element talismans. In addition to this, he also wanted to purchase a fairly priced Dao sword. Even though his peachwood sword could also subdue ghosts and even entities, the fragile nature of the peachwood meant that he would definitely be in trouble if he came across extremely strong demons who could physically damage his sword. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but grumble. He was naturally wishing that the myriad treasures in the world would only enter his pockets and not exit them. Moreover, he was slightly different from Zhang Shanfeng in the sense that he was fundamentally a pure martial artist who focused on tempering his physique and refining his fist techniques. These things belonged to him alone and could not be taken away, and they could also be viewed as a formless type of defense. Moreover, there were also the 2 flying swords in his sword-nurturing gourd that possessed boundless destructive power. Thus, Chen Ping'an didn't intend to sell or trade the small trinkets that he had seized from his enemies. After arriving at the busy Sword Water Villa, the 3 of them discovered that they were in a slightly awkward situation. There was indeed a very elderly steward Chu in the villa, but the concierge and the steward responsible for welcoming guests found a bunch of legitimate reasons to turn down the 3 strangers' request to meet Ancestor Chu. Their expressions didn't reveal anything, but it was clear that they didn't want to satisfy Chen Ping'an and his companion's request. One had to realize that Ancestor Chu was already close to 100 years old. He was a meritorious veteran who had fought alongside the villa master, and he had already stopped attending to trivial worldly matters a long time ago. After handing the Sword Water Villa to his eldest grandson, the previous villa master, the Sword Saint, became exceedingly mysterious and difficult to find. He would often travel outside for 3 to 5 years without returning to the villa. Thus, it could even be said that the highly respected Ancestor Chu was the second master of the Sword Water Villa. That being the case, could any random stranger request an audience with him? Did they view the Sword Water Villa as nothing more than a measly stall in a small town? And thus, Chen Ping'an and his companions were turned away in a lukewarm manner. Zhang Shanfeng asked Xianxia whether they could offer the steward some silver coins to resolve the situation. However, Xianxia smiled wryly and replied, "Casually offering silver coins to bribe people in the cultivation world is akin to giving them a slap. This is especially the case with leading cultivation forces such as the Sword Water Villa. Trying to bribe them with silver coins will only make things worse." Zhang Shanfeng smiled and suggested, "If push comes to shove, Big Brother Su can always demonstrate his saber techniques in front of the entrance. We'll definitely be invited inside as esteemed guests." In reality, the cultivation world wasn't especially complicated and mature in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. It couldn't compare to complete Reed Continent where there were numerous top-notch swords cultivators. As a pure martial artist at the 4th tier, Xianxia could already be regarded as a grandmaster who had the ability to act wantonly in small nations such as Colorful Garment Nation and Water Combing Nation. He also had a powerful weapon, and this made him even more impressive. If he hadn't been tricked and struck by the sneak attack of the young woman back in the old and run-down temple, and had fought against her head-on with his full strength, he wouldn't necessarily have lost to the so-called Mama, one of the 4 evil spirits of Water Combing Nation. Xianxia stroked his beard with the palm of his hand. If things didn't work out, then he could only adopt this plan as a last resort. Zhang Shanfeng suddenly tugged at their sleeves. Xianxia and Chen Ping'an turned around, only to see a huge and extravagant horse-drawn carriage slowly coming to a stop. It was very imposing, and a young girl and a burly man stepped out from the carriage. The young girl was a familiar face, none other than the demon who had caused trouble for them in the old temple. Back then, she had told Sword Saint Song Yushao that she would personally pay a visit to his Sword Water Villa. Unexpectedly, she was genuinely upholding her promise and not being perfunctory in the least. The burly man was 9 feet tall. In spite of being unarmed, His aura was overwhelming, and the esteemed guests and cultivation elites who had traveled here from all over the cultivation world all stepped back to let him through. Chun Ping'an and his companions made eye contact with the young girl. She said something to the burly man before walking over. She performed a graceful curtsy, then smiled and said, "3 gallant heroes, it was through blows that we became acquainted with each other. So why don't we share a table now that we're all guests of Swordwater Villa? Why don't we smile away our past grudges?" Xianxia exchanged a glance with Chun Ping'an and Zhang Shanfeng. He then turned around and replied with a smile, "Sure thing." It wasn't long before a hunchbacked old man walked out from the villa to welcome the young girl and the burly man. His surname was Chu, and he had received a greeting card from the burly man before they had arrived. Thus, the villa didn't dare to neglect or slight them. Xianxia borrowed this opportunity to deliver Song Yushao's message to the old man, who was none other than the villa's chief steward, Steward Chu. Upon hearing Xianxia's words, Steward Chu immediately confirmed that this was indeed the previous villa master's manner of speech. Compared to his caution when dealing with the young girl and burly man, he appeared far more sincere and warm when dealing with Xianxia and the others. Moreover, this was a critical time for the villa, so the more cultivation friends the previous villa master could make the better. If there were enough supporters, perhaps the young villa master could solidify his position as the leader of the alliance. After entering the villa, walking through corridors and navigating around shadow walls, the 3 of them were personally led to a large detached courtyard by Steward Chu. The villa was quite spectacular, and this was a serene and beautiful courtyard. As for the young girl and burly man, they were coincidentally given a nearby courtyard. Chun Ping'an had heard the sound of flowing water before entering the courtyard, so he asked Steward Chu about whether there was a stream nearby. As it turned out, there was a large and majestic waterfall not far from here. They could arrive at this waterfall if they exited through the back of the courtyard and followed the stone-slabbed path. This was a scenic spot in Swordwater Villa renowned throughout Watercombing Nation. After it rained, a rainbow would form across the waterfall and form a magnificent view. Xianxia and Zhang Shanfeng didn't want to walk around right now, so Chun Ping'an decided to visit the waterfall by himself. Zhang Shanfeng practiced his sword techniques in the courtyard. Meanwhile, Xianxia sat on a stone chair and muttered in a self-ridiculing manner, "Alrighty then, I failed to hear the crashing waterfall as a 4th-tier martial artist, yet your sensitive ears actually managed to pick it up." After walking some distance away, Steward Chu stopped in his tracks and turned around to look in the direction of the distant waterfall. "Perhaps Chun Ping'an is actually an old superior grandmaster who's regained his youth?" he murmured to himself. A visiting convoy arrived at Dragon Spring Prefecture. These were definitely rare and esteemed guests. The convoy was an official one from Great Sway Nation, and they kept a low profile and didn't use fancy carriages. Even so, their arrival still sent huge waves through the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. In fact, there were 2 pillar generals among the group of officials welcoming the convoy. One had the surname Yuan, and one had the surname Chao. There was also the head minister of the Ministry of Rights who had come from Mountain Cliff Academy. In addition to them, there were several influential officials from the capital. Without exception, these officials were all trusted subjects of the emperor. Prefectural overseer Wu Yuan was also among them, but he appeared far too unremarkable in comparison. The leader of the convoy from Great Sway Nation was an old man who wasn't a well-known figure. His surname was Gao, the same as the emperor, but his disposition was more like that of a storyteller who traveled around the world and called everywhere home. He didn't appear noble at all, and only had a single attendant, a young girl. There were 2 other carriages, with one carrying Prince Gao Xian and a eunuch wearing robes embroidered with pythons, and one carrying an assistant minister from the Ministry of Rights. This assistant minister had a lofty status, but his official rank wasn't actually very high. The 2 groups of people met at a relay station and only enjoyed a simple meal with refreshing tea. Afterward, they hurriedly made their way to Cloud Drape Mountain, which had just been elevated to the status of Northern Mountain. Wei Bo, the great mountain god of the Northern Mountain, and Chang Shuidong, previously an official in Yellow Court Nation, and now the assistant mountain master of Forest Deer Academy, patiently waited for the 2 convoys at the foot of Cloud Drape Mountain. The 3 groups converged and climbed the mountain together. The Imperial Song clan of the Great Li Empire was going to form an alliance with the Imperial Gao clan of Great Sway Nation on Cloud Drape Mountain. The 2 remaining empires in the northern region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent were going to sign a 100-year pact. While the 2 parties went through the process of forming an alliance according to Confucian etiquette, 2 young boys of the same age stood facing each other. They were both princes, and one was Song Jisun. Standing behind him was his absent-minded maidservant, Ji Gui. The other was called Gao Xian, and standing behind him was a white-haired chief eunuch wearing a python robe. The eunuch was standing in an upright and respectful manner. Gao Xian smiled and said, "We meet again." Song Jisin had a terrible impression of this prince whom he had first met in Clay Vase Alley, so he didn't acknowledge him or say anything in reply. Gao Xian had a glum expression as he said, "Fortunes ebb and flow, and you're more impressive and influential than me now." Song Jisin smiled coldly and didn't say anything. Gao Xian turned to the slim and graceful young girl and said with a faint smile, "I'm very good friends with Chun Ping, and now, when he was in Great Sui Nation, he would often mention you whenever he talked about his hometown." Ji Gui rolled her eyes in a forthright manner. As if remembering something, Gao Xian looked at Song Jisin and asked, "I wanted to buy your maidservant before, and if I remember correctly, you asked for 10,000 taels of gold. Is this offer still on the table?" Song Jisin finally opened his mouth, replying, "How much does the entire Great Sui Nation cost? Why don't you name a price? When I become rich in the future, maybe I'll buy your entire nation." Gao Xian clicked his tongue in wonder. Clothes make a person, and a saddle makes a horse, too. Your haughty manner is truly terrifying now. Then are you terrified to death now? Song Jisin sneered. Gao Xian pursed his lips, and he didn't exchange barbs with Song Jisin anymore. He turned around to look at the mountain god temple of the northern mountain that possessed a majestic aura, and he asked in a quiet voice, "If the mountain god temple of the northern mountain is here, then where is the mountain god temple of the southern mountain?" "In the east mountain of the capital where Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy was located, the other half of the Alliance Pact was being formed in an even more secretive manner. Even though the ceremony looked relatively simple, and it was kept a complete secret from non-involved parties, the officials in the capital were all extremely anxious and tense. From the emperor to the 6 ministries, and from inside the mountains to outside the mountains, everyone was relaxed on the outside but tense on the inside. Everyone kept a close eye on Mountain Cliff Academy. Fortunately, Assistant Mountain Master Mao Xiaodong was like an old hen looking after her chicks, and he had strongly requested the Imperial Court of Great Sui Nation not to pause the normal teaching schedule in the academy due to this matter. In the end, it was because of this that the large majority of teachers and students in the academy didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Great Sui Nation was on high alert, but they couldn't be blamed for making such a big fuss. This was because the representative from the Great Li Empire responsible for signing the East Mountain Alliance had far too powerful a background. He was none other than Cui Chan, the imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire. In a serene courtyard in Mountain Cliff Academy, a young girl was sitting in a kneeling position by the door. She felt so apprehensive that she didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. She was Xianxia, a young girl now famous in the capital of Great Sui Nation. 2 people sat opposite each other in the room. At the same time, from another perspective, there was only one person in the room. There was the young Cui Chan in flowing white robes, and there was the old Cui Chan in azure Confucian robes. The 2 of them didn't say anything to each other after meeting. They only played a game of Go with each other, and it was eventually the young Cui Chan who now went by Cui Dongshan who had lost by a single move. However, Cui Dongshan wasn't in a bad mood because of this, and he reviewed the game with a relaxed grin. Meanwhile, the old Cui Chan had a solemn expression as he accepted the cup of hot tea that Xianxia was apprehensively handing over. He slowly sipped the tea and didn't look at the Go board. "Are you unwilling to accept my request even if there's a method to fuse our souls back together?" the old Cui Chan suddenly asked. Cui Dongshan continued to pick up Go pieces and place them back in the Go box. "Do you really need to ask?" he huffed. "What kind of temper and attitude does Cui Chan have? He'd rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a phoenix. This was the case 100 years ago, and this will still be the case 10,000 years from now. Life is unpredictable and filled with all kinds of preposterous occurrences." The old Cui Chan sighed. Cui Dongshan chuckled and asked, "It's difficult for me to obtain information now. So can you tell me if things have become chaotic near Colorful Garment Nation in the central region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent?" The old Cui Chan nodded and replied, "Even though there was a small accident, this wasn't enough to obstruct the great trend. Chaos is already inevitable." Cui Dongshan spent a long time tidying up the Go board. Then, he shot a sideways glance at the old geezer sitting in an upright manner as if he owned the place, and immediately felt a slight sense of anger. He refused to act as a servant any further, and he stretched his arms and legs and lay down on the exquisitely woven bamboo mat. "You have better fortune than me, and the old scholar is someone who bullies the weak and fears the strong. He was unwilling to target you, so he came over to pick on me, a naive and harmless young boy, instead. You don't understand how many eye rolls and grievances I suffered on my journey from Jewel Small World to the capital of Great Sui Nation." Cui Dongshan mumbled. The old Cui Chan remained silent. Cui Dongshan was sprawled on the bamboo mat, looking at the ceiling. He touched his forehead, as if he could still feel some lingering pain there. This was a mental trauma that the stinky little girl, Li Baoping, had smashed into him using that seal. Cui Dongshan crossed his legs and sighed. The emperor of Great Sui Nation is also a bold and courageous person, being willing to swallow this humiliation and shoulder a heavy burden. He was surprisingly willing to accept this utter humiliation and sign an alliance treaty with the Great Li Empire. However, the Imperial Gao clan from Yang County will have to hide in their shell for 100 years because of this. They'll have to yield to the whims of others and hand over all of their vassal states, including Yellow Court Nation. They can only watch on as the armored cavalry of Great Li Empire navigates around their land and marches down south, laying down the foundations for their historical feat of conquering and uniting the entire Eastern Treasured Vile Continent in the future. Can you or I predict the state of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent in a century? The old Cui Chan asked in a calm voice. Even if we can, will we definitely be correct? The Imperial Gao clan of Great Sui Nation might be willing to endure this humiliation today, but perhaps this is their first step to coming from behind and overtaking the Great Li Empire. Cui Dongshan shook his head and remarked, "If it were me, I definitely wouldn't be able to endure such humiliation." Cui Chan chuckled coldly and assessed. "As it turns out, my mind and my judgment skills were really pathetic during my youth. No wonder I'm in such a miserable state today." Cui Dongshan didn't become angry. He gently swayed a leg and wrapped his hands behind his head like a pillow. As he dazedly stared at the ceiling, he said, "For some reason, you look down on me, but I also dislike you. We're looking into a mirror, and we both detest what we see. Haha. There are actually such interesting things in the world." Cui Chan hesitated for a moment before revealing, "Grandpa has arrived in Dragon Spring Prefecture, and he's now staying in a bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain. He's already become much more clear-headed than before, but I knew there would be a cursed but." Cui Dongshan covered his ears and rolled around on the bamboo mat. At the same time, he copied Li Huai's howling as he shouted, "I'm not listening. I'm not listening." Cui Chan ignored him and continued. Before leaving Majestic World, Lu Chen found him and exchanged blows with him inside the bamboo building. Grandpa is completely obsessed with fist techniques, so much so that he's almost fallen to heretical ways. Because of this, his biggest desire is to find out just how powerful the Tao of 10th tier martial artists is. He wants to see whether it's superior or inferior to the Tao of 13th tier or even 14th tier chi refiners. Even if it's inferior, he wants to see just how much it's inferior by. So, even though he was facing a branch master of the Taoist sect, Cui Dongshan turned around to look at Cui Chan sitting on the other side of the Go table. When he's in Majestic World, Lu Chen also has to abide by the rules established by the Confucian Temple, right? He can only wield the power of a 13th tier chi refiner at most. Meanwhile, Grandpa has returned to the 10th tier, so he has a chance to rival Lu Chen if he can return to his peak. He won't face certain death even in the worst-case scenario. Cui Chan shook his head and explained. Lu Chen used a small trick and dragged Grandpa into a small world. By doing so, their battlefield was no longer in Majestic World. Cui Dongshan suddenly stood up, with killing intent spreading across his face. His voice was extremely restrained and calm as he asked, "Did Grandpa die?" Cui Chan took a sip of tea and slowly replied, "No, he didn't." He walked out of Downtrodden Mountain afterward, and he was like an ordinary resident in the small town as he busied himself with the task of buying the 4 treasures of the study. When I found Grandpa, he told me that Lu Chen used a mystical Tao technique to summon 10 historical martial artists at the 10th tier inside his small world. They were all under Lu Chen's control. Just think about it, one punch from each of the historical 10th tier martial artists would mean certain death. With this in mind, would you still throw a punch? Cui Dongshan stood up before sitting down and crossing his legs again. He reached up to grab his hair, and there was annoyance on his face as he replied, "I naturally wouldn't, but Grandpa definitely would." Did Grandpa not know about the significance of this? If he didn't throw the punch, then that would essentially equate to abandoning any hope of reaching the legendary 11th tier of martial arts. If he didn't throw the punch, then wouldn't that be giving up his lifelong pursuit of reaching the peak of martial arts? Cui Chan put the teacup on the table and asked, "Then have you thought about this before? What if he survived even after throwing that punch? In fact, what if he successfully advanced to the 11th tier of martial arts? At that time, both you and I, as well as Chun Ping'an, will never enjoy another peaceful day. Those powerful figures who have remained hidden behind the scenes for hundreds upon thousands of years can tolerate 10th tier martial artists appearing in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. However, they might not tolerate the appearance of a new 11th tier martial god. In this sense, Grandpa's punch was a transaction with Branchmaster Lu Chen. One can also say that it was a transaction with Middle-earth Divine Continent. He exchanged the 11th tier of martial arts for an opportunity to buy miscellaneous items from the marketplace. He exchanged it for a peaceful life. Cui Dongshan leaned back and plunked onto the floor, muttering, "How boring." Cui Chan's heart shuddered slightly, and he instantly snapped his head around to look toward the door. Cui Dongshan did the same. "Qi Jingchun, you were like a ghost that couldn't stop haunting me, and you're finally willing to disappear for good now. I want to see whether you still have any trump cards to play go with me," Cui Chan said with a cold smile. "Old Cui, you can muck around with this if you want," Cui Dongshan said in a listless manner. "However, I won't accompany you to play go with Qi Jingchun. This is even more boring." Cui Chan humphed coldly and stood up to peer down at the young him. "Wet mud can't form a wall." "One," he sneered. Cui Dongshan didn't feel embarrassed in the least. Instead, there was a grin on his face as he chuckled. "Lying in wet mud to sunbask actually feels quite comfortable. Please don't help me up. I'll get angry at whoever tries to help me up. Hand it over." Cui Chan extended a hand and demanded. "Hand what over?" Cui Dongshan blinked and asked. "That minimization treasure." Cui Chan replied with a dark expression. Cui Dongshan rolled to his side and turned his butt toward Cui Chan. There was a cloudy look on Cui Chan's face as he relented and said, "I'll temporarily lend it to you for 20 years. After that, I'll take it back even if you haven't advanced to the upper 5 tiers yet." Cui Dongshan quickly turned around and raised a hand, haggling, "At least 50 years. Cui Chan walked to the door and flicked his large sleeve, replying, 30 years. Otherwise, I'll beat you to death right now if you dare to push your luck any further." After Cui Chan left the courtyard, Cui Dongshan rolled across the bamboo mat all the way until he reached the door. Xianxia was like a wooden puppet, and she had sat in a kneeling position beside the door threshold the entire time. Cui Dongshan lazily stood up and shot a sideways glance at the young girl's sitting posture. He chuckled and said, "Xianxia, your butt is actually quite big. No wonder you want to become my master's wife." The young girl remained silent and unmoving as she obediently sat there. Cui Dongshan jumped up and ran to the young girl's side. He then viciously kicked her butt and sent her sprawling into the courtyard. The young boy in white placed his hands on his hips and chortled with laughter. The young girl silently stood up, not even patting the dirt from her clothes. Cui Dongshan sighed and lightly hammered his chest, lamenting, "It's like daggers are cutting at my heart when I see you in such a pitiful state." Xianxia forcefully squeezed out a smile. Cui Dongshan hurriedly covered his eyes with a hand. At the same time, he vigorously shook his other hand and exclaimed, "Hurry up and turn your head around. Heavens, I'm seeing a ghost during the daytime. Your young master is about to go blind." The young girl turned around and cast her gaze upward. There were blue skies for as far as the eye could see. When she was young, she had never understood why a cloudless sky represented the best weather. After all, wouldn't iridescent clouds be more spectacular and beautiful? Only after entering the mountains did she understand the reason behind this. Without clouds, there wouldn't be rain. Li Baoping used an alliance leader badge, carved from wood to summon everyone over. She had drawn inspiration from a novel that she had just finished reading, one that described the adventures of a gallant cultivator. He was a respected alliance leader in the martial arts world, and he could command the others once he showed his alliance leader badge. He was very mighty and impressive. Holding the self-crafted alliance leader badge in her hand, Li Baoping swaggered around to knock on everyone's doors. She didn't say anything, and simply raised the badge in her hand with a stern expression. After doing this, she would walk away to knock on the next door. In the end, Lin Shui, Li Huai, Yulu, Xianxia, and even Cui Dongshan came over to join in the fun. They gathered in Li Baoping's dormitory and waited for the alliance leader of the martial arts world to speak. Li Baoping cleared her throat and hung the wooden badge around her neck. There was a thick envelope on the table. The young girl in the bright red jacket slowly opened the envelope and said with a solemn expression, "Junior uncle wrote a letter to all of us. As division leader of the East Mountain Division, which falls under the jurisdiction of Dragon Spring Prefecture Headquarters, I'm now going to read the letter to all of you. Remember not to make loud noises, and make sure not to become distracted. Don't, Li Huai, sit still. And you, Cui Dongshan, you're not allowed to cross your legs. You Lu, stop snacking on sunflower seeds." The group of children and youths had no option but to sit still and obediently listen to the little girl. Li Baoping read the letter that her junior uncle had addressed to her first. She read it with rhythm and cadence. She then carefully folded the letter and placed it beside her hand. She retrieved the second letter, which was addressed to Li Huai. The next letter was addressed to Lin Shui, and the final letter was addressed to both Yulu and Xianxia. The contents of the letters were mainly regarding trivial matters that had occurred in the small town during the new year. Chun Ping'an also told them not to argue with each other, especially since they were away from home now. It was important for them to work together and be nice to each other. They shouldn't let their family worry, but they shouldn't tire themselves out from studying too much either. From time to time, they should also leave the mountain to clear their mind. They could stroll around the capital of Great Sui Nation together, or they could engage in some other relaxing activities. Apart from this, Chun Ping'an had also written about some strange events and peculiar individuals that he had encountered after leaving the capital of Great Sui Nation. He also described his experience on the Kuan ship, and he recounted what the scenery was like when he looked down from high up in the sky. His descriptions weren't artistic in the least. Rather, they were straightforward and without flair. However, Chun Ping'an's words were filled with a sense of sincerity that allowed everyone to clearly visualize his posture when he had written these letters. Chun Ping'an would have definitely been sitting in an even more upright manner than them. Moreover, his expression would have also been serious and meticulous. After reading all of the letters, Li Baoping brought her hands down in a calming gesture and announced, "That's all." Li Baoping, Chun Ping'an pretty much wrote a letter to each of us. So can't you directly hand them over to whoever they were addressed to? Li Huai asked with a puzzled expression. The little girl shot a glare at Li Huai, causing him to shrink back in apprehension. Cui Dongshan pointed at himself and asked, "Where's my letter?" Li Baoping crossed her arms and sat down on a bench with her legs crossed. She then shook her head and replied, "Junior uncle didn't write a letter to you." Cui Dongshan raised his head and pretended to shed tears. "There's actually such a heartless and unjust teacher in the world," he murmured. Li Baoping suddenly laughed loudly and pulled several banknotes from the envelope. These were official banknotes of the Great Li Empire, and she explained, "Junior uncle mentioned a matter in my letter, but I forgot to read it just then. Here, take it. Junior uncle said that he owes you 2,000 taels of silver, so he's returning it to you now. Cui Dongshan, you can't lie and say that Junior uncle didn't return the money to you in the future. I can act as a witness for Junior uncle." Cui Dongshan accepted the banknotes with a heartbroken expression. A flicker of hope suddenly appeared in his eyes, and he asked, "Bao Ping, did your junior uncle mention anything about couplets? I wrote them. Did teacher put them up on New Year's Eve? Can you carefully go over the letter again? What if you missed something?" "I didn't miss anything,"
Li Baoping replied firmly.
"I've already read over the letter 9 times. I can recite it from back to front." There was a look of suspicion on Cui Dongshan's face, and he bent down and reached over to grab the letter. He wanted to read it himself. However, Li Baoping immediately placed a hand on the carefully stacked pile of letters and glared at the young boy who was nothing more than a defeated opponent. "How dare you? There was always one matter to subdue another matter." Cui Dongshan huffed and retracted his hand. He plunked back down and heaved a long sigh, feeling like life wasn't worth living anymore. "Cui Dongshan, do you feel like these notes are an eyesore? Why don't you give them to me?" Li Huai said quietly. Cui Dongshan put the banknotes away and shot a sideways glance at the little boy. "The banknotes aren't an eyesore, but you, little brat, are indeed an eyesore." Li Huai crossed his arms like Li Baoping and replied smugly, "Be careful of what you say. Do you not know that I'm the division leader of the East Section dormitory that's under the jurisdiction of the East Mountain Division, which falls under the jurisdiction of Dragon Spring Prefecture headquarters?" Cui Dongshan stood up and patted his bottom, scolding with a smile, "Piss off." Li Baoping collected all of the letters and placed them back into the envelope. "I'll look after these letters for everyone, lest you lose them by accident." "Dismissed." Cui Dongshan yawned and left the dormitory. Lin Shuyi and Li Huai also left together. Yu Lu and Xianxia left last. As he walked, Yu Lu smiled and remarked in a soft voice, "In the letter that Chun Ping'an wrote to us, my section of the letter had 24 more characters than yours. Yu Lu, just how childish are you?" Xianxia grumbled with a dark expression. Yu Lu smiled in a very punchable manner. Deep in the mountains located in Swordwater Villa, a spectacular waterfall that looked like a white silk cloth descending from the skies. There was a dark green pool at the bottom of the waterfall, one that was so deep that its bottom couldn't be seen. The blurry silhouette of a red fish vaguely appeared for a moment, then disappeared once more. The waterfall was thunderous, and water vapor permeated the surroundings. Chun Ping'an mulled over a question as he stood in an exquisite waterside pavilion located beside the deep pool. If he launched a sword strike, could he slash open the curtain of water booming down the waterfall? Chun Ping'an contemplated the power of the crashing water before considering his own awkward situation. He couldn't even launch a proper sword strike yet. Thus, the answer was a resounding no. With a tap of his foot, Chun Ping'an leaped up and landed on the red railing of the waterside pavilion. He initially wanted to practice standing meditation, but his hand involuntarily reached down and grabbed the sword-nurturing gourd. He went with the flow and took a sip of wine. He then looked up at the peak of the waterfall before slowly shifting his gaze downward. The waterfall was like a burst of sword chi flowing down into the mortal world from an immortal's sleeve. Chun Ping'an attained some enlightenment while observing the waterfall, but he ultimately didn't draw his locust-wood sword to emulate the sword strike that Mr. Chi had unleashed toward the pink-robed great demon in the old temple. What in the world is going on? Chun Ping'an murmured to himself. Why do I feel like my movements will definitely be wrong if I launch a sword strike? Perhaps fist techniques are completely different from sword techniques? Maybe one of them can be mastered through hard work, while the other can only be mastered through talent. Right now, Chun Ping'an was still unaware of the fact that this wasn't because of his lack of comprehension skills, and it most definitely wasn't because of his lack of talent in swordsmanship. Rather, everyone whom he had come across was far too powerful and profound for him, a third-tier martial artist, to comprehend. This was in terms of both their cultivation base and their mystical sword techniques. However, Chun Ping'an's eyesight and observation skills were very good. Thus, he was able to catch many fine details that ordinary martial artists were unable to notice. As a result, he felt a formless pressure weighing on himself, especially since he had a habit of seeking perfection whenever he did something. Every time he wanted to launch a sword strike, he would inevitably compare himself to those profound cultivators and end up feeling like his sword weighed thousands of pounds. Chun Ping'an had come across all kinds of powerful cultivators on his journey. There was Wind Snow Temple's Wei Jin, a terrestrial sword immortal who had shattered the female ghost's barrier with a single slash, with his sword arriving before his person. Afterward, the Mahist cultivator Su Rua had drawn his blade, a mountain range that he had obtained from visualization and meditation, a small amount, and used it to block Wei Jin's strike. Then there was also Qi Jing Chun, who had casually and relaxedly launched a sword strike to shatter the Chaos Origin Golden Light Formation, a technique from White Emperor City's demonic orthodoxy. This was completely different from his experience of learning the mountain-shaking fist from Ning Yao in Clay Vase Alley. Back then, Chun Ping'an could somewhat imitate Ning Yao's movements after watching her perform walking meditation a few times. In fact, he could even imitate some of the true intent of this fist technique. However, Cui Chan's grandpa had already offered a conclusion regarding this. After reading the mountain-shaking guide, he said that the mountain-shaking fist was, in fact, an extremely simple and crude fist technique. It was barely worth a mention, and a fist technique that anyone could imitate. This was indeed the case, just like how Blusher Prefecture's Zhao Xuxia could also temper his physique after watching Chun Ping'an for a while and imitating the walking meditation. However, the most valuable part of the mountain-shaking fist was its attitude and will. Thus, getting started with the mountain-shaking fist was easy, but trying to fully comprehend and master the fist technique was difficult. One only needed to look at the tenet of the mountain-shaking fist. Those who practice the mountain-shaking fist in the future, remember this even if you're facing the founders of the three teachings. Your fist technique is allowed to be weak, and your fist technique is also allowed to lose in battles. However, the fist intent that you possess definitely can't take a single step in retreat. When Cui Chan's grandpa had come across Lu Chun after returning to the peak stage of the 10th tier, had he chosen to throw a punch at his opponent? No, he hadn't. Regardless of what his considerations were, the end result was that he hadn't thrown a punch at Lu Chun. From this, one could see just how difficult it was to fully achieve the essence of the mountain-shaking fist. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was as difficult as ascending the heavens. The descending water crashed into the pool and sent splashes of water flying everywhere, as if millions of pearls were exploding in unison and giving rise to a veiled mist. Aoyang. Practicing the sword is so difficult. Chun Ping'an scratched his head in a dazed manner before drinking a sip of wine. He felt a little helpless. He looked around while standing on the railing of the waterside pavilion, and his gaze eventually settled on the peak of the waterfall again. Even though he no longer felt the urge to launch a sword strike, he recalled the words of Cui Chan's grandpa. The old man had helped him temper his third-tier physique. When describing the rain evaporation technique, the barefoot old man had frankly recounted his feat of forcing the rain to retreat into the sky the first time he had unleashed this technique. Gazing at the giant waterfall that was thundering down right now, Chun Ping'an was curious about whether the old man in the bamboo building could throw a punch and cause the waterfall to retreat or even flow backward. The young boy's urge to launch an unfamiliar sword strike immediately became an urge to throw an extremely familiar punch. Chun Ping'an immediately became confident again, and this was a sense of confidence that stemmed from his experience of doing his walking meditation hundreds of thousands of times. This confidence stemmed from his refusal to retreat even when facing powerful opponents. Chun Ping'an looked at the spectacular waterfall, and a wild thought suddenly occurred to him. If he unleashed his full power to throw a punch, Could he potentially blast a hole into the curtain of water? After blasting a hole into the curtain of water by luck, might there be a wisp of his fist aura that continued forward and slammed into the tough stone cliff behind it? Could someone like Xianxia, a martial artist from the cultivation world who had already been at the chi refining tier for many years, smash a small crater into the stone cliff? Chun Pingyan was tempted to try. However, he quickly hopped down the railing and sat on the long bench in the waterside pavilion. He started to drink wine, and he looked much like a tourist who had come to the villa to enjoy the scenery. Chun Pingyan looked toward the mountain path, and it wasn't long before a group of people in bright-colored clothes slowly walked over. Some people were talking and laughing loudly, with an aura of might in their voices, while some people were talking gently in a calm and refined manner. There were also graceful women whose smiles were as beautiful as blooming flowers. Of the three people walking in front, the person in the middle was a handsome young master whose complexion was as fair as jade. There was a jade pendant hanging from one side of his waist and an uncommon short sword hanging on the other side. He appeared dignified and extraordinary. To his left was a middle-aged man with a saber, and this person walked with an aura as mighty and domineering as dragons and tigers. Right now, he was looking around with a complacent expression. To his right was a young scholar wearing a square kerchief on his head and holding a folding fan. Several women and young girls were behind the three of them, all of them possessing extraordinary dispositions and appearances. There was a girl among them who looked to be around 17 or 18, and she was no shorter than the men around her. Her expression was ice-cold and aloof, and a long saber decorated with gold was hanging by her waist. The saber was in an exquisite scabbard, but her manner of wearing the scabbard was very strange and uncommon. It was attached to her waist in the reverse direction, just like the middle-aged man's. She glanced at the locust-wood sword case on Chun Pingyan's back before glancing at the vermilion wine gourd by his waist. She couldn't determine his background or cultivation base from these, so she quickly lost interest in the young boy. Further back, there was an entourage of guards and followers. Most of them were strong young men with imposing auras and intense gazes. Among them, a person with an ox horn bow slung on his back was the most eye-catching. An indescribable aura of the cultivation world swept toward the waterside pavilion. The mountain path to Sword Water. Villa's waterfall led to a dead end, and the final destination of the path was none other than the waterside pavilion. The path was narrow, and there was almost no space left as the group of people walked along it. Thus, Chun Pingyan had no option but to remain in the waterside pavilion for the moment. He would find an opportunity to leave after these people entered the pavilion. The three men in front walked up the steps first, followed by the group of women and young girls behind them. Meanwhile, the guards and followers spread out to keep watch and guard over the different areas of the waterside pavilion. Most of them just took a cursory glance at the young boy with the sword case on his back, then proceeded to ignore him. The young master in the middle had the aura of a descendant from a powerful clan, and his gaze paused slightly when he swept his eyes over Chun Pingyan. It was as if he were waiting for Chun Pingyan to speak first. However, Chun Pingyan appeared slightly plain and demure when their gazes locked together. The young master smiled faintly and nodded in greeting. In reality, however, he was feeling a little puzzled at this moment. Many powerful cultivators from all over the cultivation world had come to Sword Water Villa, yet there was actually someone who didn't recognize him. Only after seeing this did Chun Pingyan return the gesture and nod in greeting. Just as Chun Pingyan was about to take this opportunity to leave the waterside pavilion, a young woman sitting beside the young master looked at Chun Pingyan and said in a gentle voice, "Young master, if you've come here to enjoy the scenery, then you don't need to leave if you still want to enjoy the view for a bit longer." Chun Pingyan faltered upon hearing this. This was because the young woman had spoken using the official dialect of Water Combing Nation, a dialect that he didn't understand at all. The young woman realized this, and she immediately repeated her words using the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Chun Pingyan finally understood what she was saying. The middle-aged man turned to Chun Pingyan and said, "Young lad, you can be at ease and stay here. There's no need to feel reserved, and you can drink and enjoy the scenery as you please. If we consider who arrived here first, it's actually our group that is disturbing your peace and leisure. Of course, you can feel free to leave afterward if you find us too noisy." After hearing this, most people would feel forced to remain seated in the same spot for a while longer. However, Chun Pingyan cupped his fists and replied, "I've already been here for half a day and enjoyed the scenery of the waterfall. I'm going to take my leave now." The middle-aged man with the saber by his waist laughed heartily as he surprisingly stood up and returned the gesture. "No worries at all. Please suit yourself." One of the youngest girls widened her eyes in disbelief. She felt unfamiliar young boy truly had terrible observation skills. Moreover, he also appeared very arrogant. Was he truly unaware of who that young master in the waterside pavilion was? Did he not know that this person was Song Fengshan, the young villa master of Swordwater Villa? He was a top-notch young sword immortal in the cultivation world of Watercombing Nation. In fact, it was rumored that a princess admired him so much that she had almost run away from home to elope with him. Even if the young boy didn't recognize the young villa master, did he not recognize the powerful person who dared to wear his saber in reverse as well? The middle-aged man who had cupped his fists at Chun Ping'an appeared especially friendly and approachable, and completely unlike a powerful figure from the cultivation world. In reality, however, he was the current villa master of Unruly Saber Villa, a mountain villa that was equally as renowned and powerful as Swordwater Villa. He was a renowned first-rate saber superior grandmaster in Watercombing Nation, and he had once traveled across the cultivation world of more than a dozen nations. His might and power were known far and wide, and even Sword Saint Song Yushao had personally praised his saber skills as brilliant and only a hair away from reaching a divine martial level. The young girl was secretly amused, and contemplated whether this impoverished-looking young boy was a young hatchling who had only just entered the cultivation world. Or perhaps he was an audacious thief who had snuck into Swordwater Villa. So he didn't dare to remain here for too long? Haha, things would be very interesting if that were truly the case. Chun Ping'an exited the waterside pavilion and walked down the steps. However, an aloof voice suddenly traveled over from behind him. Please wait for a moment. Chun Ping'an turned around and saw that it was the girl wearing her saber in reverse who had spoken. She walked to the top of the steps and looked down at him, asking, "Who's your master? Are you from a sword sect in Colorful Garment Nation or Ancient Elm Nation?" Even though the young girl appeared slightly overbearing, Chun Ping'an still shook his head and tried his best to maintain a sense of politeness as he replied, "I come from a place even further north, and I visited Swordwater Villa with my friends because we heard that the young villa master is going to be nominated as the alliance leader of the martial arts world in Watercombing Nation. We want to find an opportunity to congratulate him." The handsome young master smiled faintly. Meanwhile, the young scholar lightly rocked his folding fan and teased, "The deity is present, yet the mortal is unaware." The middle-aged man looked at the young girl and huffed, "You little martial arts addict, don't be disrespectful toward other guests. What did I say to you before? You can't try to compete and spar with everyone after leaving Unruly Saber Villa." The young girl placed her palm on the hilt of her saber, causing the tip of the saber to tilt slightly upward and precisely point at Chun Ping'an standing at the bottom of the steps. She completely ignored the middle-aged man's words as she kept her gaze fixed on Chun Ping'an and asked, "Are you at the second tier or third tier of martial arts? How many years have you practiced the sword for?" Chun Ping'an furrowed his brow and cupped his fists. He then turned around to leave, not planning to interact with this young girl from a powerful clan in Watercombing Nation anymore. Chun Ping'an was easygoing and polite, but this didn't mean that he didn't have his own principles and bottom line. When it came to strangers, Chun Ping'an wouldn't provoke them, but he wouldn't fear them either. Kai Jinjian, Fu Nanhua, the mountain-moving ape, the white python that he had killed in Go Table Mountain, the officials and guards on the ship traveling across embroidered Flower River, the young Chui Chan who had refused to come up from the bottom of the old well in Yellow Court Nation, and the female ghost whose soul he had obliterated with his fists while holding her neck in the old temple not long ago. All of these individuals had experienced the young boy's wrath after crossing his bottom line. The young girl had a cold smile on her face as she softly scorned, "Trash like you still have the face to walk around the cultivation world with swords on their back? You still dare to enter Swordwater Villa? Maybe the person who taught you swordsmanship only taught you how to be a coward." Hey! The middle-aged man felt slightly exasperated and helpless. His daughter's temper had always been ever since birth, and it was truly a crappy temper that caused a lot of trouble. However, regardless of how he grumbled about this, the middle-aged man was still extremely proud of his only child's martial arts talent. He didn't conceal his expectations, and directly announced that his daughter wouldn't marry out. Instead, her husband would have to enter Unruly Saber Villa. This was because his daughter was destined to become the next villa master of Unruly Saber Villa. The middle-aged man was unwilling to rely on his strength to pick on others, so he stood up and was just about to persuade his daughter to stop provoking that young boy from another nation. After all, martial arts needed to uphold martial virtue as the most important thing. Martial prowess was only secondary. However, he knew that his daughter was truly unwilling to listen to these old principles. Not only her, but the young prodigies in the current cultivation world were all uninterested in these teachings. Which of them didn't treat these teachings as passing wind? Their faces would be filled with impatience, and they would snort in contempt behind their elders' backs. The most impressive and renowned young prodigy in Watercombing Nation during the past 10 years was none other than the young villa master sitting in the waterside pavilion. He was already at the 4th tier of martial arts at such a young age, and he had already earned the title of small sword immortal for himself. Each time Song Fengshan needed to launch a sword strike, regardless of whether he was challenged by someone else or he was the challenger, he would definitely burn incense, bathe, and change into brand new clothes that he had never worn before, and he would never let his opponent walk away alive. However, this sword prodigy who killed with resoluteness would extremely likely become the youngest 5th-tier grandmaster in the history of Watercombing Nation. After advancing to the 5th tier at 30 and defeating the green bamboo sword immortal, Song Fengshan could legitimately assume the title of sword immortal. At that time, his grandpa, Sword Saint Song Yushao, would still be alive. And now that colorful garment nation's sword god was dead, who in the surrounding dozen or so nations could still rival Sword Water Villa? This was a critical reason behind why the cultivation world of Watercombing Nation was willing to yield to this junior. However, Song Yushao had seldom shown himself for the past several dozen years, and this was a reflection of his disappointment toward the current cultivation world. It was rumored that this grandpa and grandson didn't have a very good relationship with each other, and it was said that the old sword saint especially disliked his granddaughter-in-law, who was soft on the outside but ruthless on the inside. After hearing the girl's taunting remarks, even someone as easygoing as Chun Pingyan couldn't help but come to a sudden stop. He turned around to look toward the waterside pavilion. Chun Pingyan didn't know much about the so-called rules of the cultivation world, and he was even more ignorant when it came to the local traditions and customs in Watercombing Nation. However, the young boy felt like there were some principles that could be applied no matter where one was, and there were some matters that were black and white regardless of the situation. Fortunately, the middle-aged man had already walked next to his daughter and scolded her with a stern expression, saying, "With such arrogance and such a fiery temper, how can I possibly dare to let you travel around the cultivation world by yourself? We'll push it back by a year." The young girl was enraged, and her ice-cold face became increasingly chilly. However, the person beside her was her father after all, and he was also her master who had taught her martial arts and saber skills. He was both a father and a mentor. Moreover, there were so many outsiders present, so what more could she do? Especially since she had heard so many stories about the martial arts world from a young age, no matter how frustrated she felt, she could only humph coldly and shut her mouth, not taunting the young boy anymore. She turned around and walked back to the long bench in the waterside pavilion. She sat down and turned her head to look at the crashing waterfall in a foul mood. There was an apologetic expression on the middle-aged man's face as he said, "Young lad, I, Wang Iran, apologize to you on behalf of my daughter." Chun Pingyan nodded in acknowledgement before turning around to leave. He had a terrible impression of the young girl, especially since she reminded him of Zhu He and Zhu Lu. This was an identical situation. Their fathers were clearly reasonable and amiable people, so how were their daughters so arrogant and self-centered? Upon thinking of Zhu Lu who had attempted to assassinate him, Chun Pingyan naturally thought of the mastermind behind the assassination attempt as well, Li Baoping's second brother, Li Baozhen. This was a grudge that couldn't be avoided. Chun Pingyan couldn't help but sigh. He left without saying anything, and this truly pushed the already furious girl over the edge. She was unable to endure this anymore, and she immediately stood up and scolded him with a furious expression. "The mighty Villa Master of Unruly Saber Villa personally apologized to you, and you, bastard, aren't even going to say anything in reply? Fatherless scum." Chun Pingyan expressionlessly turned around and tightened the rope of his sword case. "If you want to spar, then let's go ahead and spar." Chun Pingyan had remained largely silent for the 350-kilometer trip from the old temple to Sword Water Villa. He wasn't in a good mood. Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng had also noticed this, so the big-bearded martial artist had even reined in his habit of drinking by a noticeable degree. He didn't make crude remarks while drinking or eating either. It was also because of this that the two of them had tacitly turned down the offer to visit the waterfall together with Chun Pingyan even though they wanted to go. They wanted Chun Pingyan to get some fresh air and relax by himself. The young girl strode to the top of the steps and sneered, "All right, I've been waiting for this." However, Chun Pingyan's next question astonished everyone in the waterside pavilion, making them look at him in a new light. "Does a spoken life and death contract count? Young lad, sparring is okay, and I won't interfere no matter what the outcome is," Wang Iran, the renowned saber grandmaster from Watercombing Nation, said in a stern voice. "However, I don't wish to see a life and death battle. The two of you can spar until a victor is decided." How does that sound? The girl was just about to say something, but Wang Iran immediately glared at her with an intense gaze. The young girl had almost never seen such a strict expression on her father's face before, so she was immediately scared into silence. She didn't dare to retort the young boy anymore. Wang Iran stared at Chun Pingyan and said, "If you want to make a life and death contract before fighting, I definitely won't agree to the fight. If you only want to spar, however, then I'm willing to let my daughter suffer this hardship even if your attacks are merciless. I hope she can take this opportunity to understand the depth of the martial arts world. She has to learn that some half-assed skills don't make her invincible, and she should temper down her arrogance. In the end, the middle-aged man turned around to glance at his daughter. Uttering these words in front of so many outsiders fully reflected the serious nature of his words. One could admonish their children in the presence of others, but one could only admonish their wife in private. This was most likely an old rule from the old cultivation world. Chun Ping'an took a deep breath and said, "Then we'll spar." Standing beside his daughter, Wang Yiran lowered his voice and said, "Shan Hu, remember to control your strength when you spar. It's never good to completely burn one's bridges, so don't make your path in the cultivation world too narrow." Wang Yiran was still of the opinion that his daughter was more likely to win. As her father, however, he still had to teach her the important principles first. The girl looked at the young boy who was standing on the narrow path outside the waterside pavilion. She pursed her lips and replied, "I know, father." She placed her hand on the hilt of her saber and smiled faintly. With a tap of her feet, she then leaped high into the air toward the ignorant young swordsman. While in the air, the girl drew her famous saber. At the same instant, a dull thud echoed over from the small path, and the figure that had been in the corners of everyone's eyes suddenly vanished without a trace. In the next instant, the young boy with the sword case on his back reappeared in front of the young girl who was about to raise her saber. His fist slammed into her forehead, and he borrowed the reaction force to nimbly jump back to his original position. Rather than resuming his fighting stance, however, he just stood there in a carefree manner. Meanwhile, the girl looked like a ragdoll as she flew over the roof of the waterside pavilion and eventually crashed into the pool under the waterfall. Nobody knew whether she was alive or dead. This was a sparring match between two young cultivators. One party had been loud like thunder, but the expected lightning had never made an appearance. One party had been extremely direct, and even though no thunder had echoed, the lightning bolt had struck hard. Chun Ping'an turned around to leave. While doing so, he grabbed his wine gourd and lifted it high up to take a swig of wine. He showed his back to everyone in the waterside pavilion. As it turned out, even clay bodhisattvas had a temper. Wang Yiran had a solemn expression as he turned around and leaped onto the railing of the waterside pavilion. He didn't have time to deal with his frightened female relatives in the pavilion, and he rapidly dashed toward the pool to scoop up his defeated daughter. The young villa master of Swordwater Villa was unfazed, and the young scholar rocking his fan clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "I didn't expect him to be a powerful martial artist hiding his true strength." The young scholar closed his folding fan with a crack before focusing his gaze on the young boy, who was disappearing further and further into the distance. This young boy with the sword case on his back was definitely a lesser grandmaster at the 4th tier of martial arts. Perhaps he was the final disciple of Colorful Garment Nation's sword god? However, the cultivation world was dangerous and his master had been violently killed in a mountain. So he had no option but to disguise himself as a traveling cultivator from another nation? Had he traveled far away to flee from danger? Otherwise, who could have raised such a young martial arts prodigy? He had reached the grandmaster stage even earlier than Song Fengshan. Song Fengshan's wife, a beautiful and virtuous-looking young woman, couldn't help but ask in a soft voice, "Will Shan Hu be okay?" Song Fengshan imperceptibly caressed the hilt of his sword, vast water, with his thumb. He smiled and remained silent. The young scholar smiled faintly and explained, "Please rest assured, milady. Lady Wang isn't in any danger, nor has she been severely wounded." The young boy used a clever technique, and he only used the external power of his fist aura to knock Lady Wang unconscious. Lady Wang only suffered some external wounds that won't affect her physique or soul. The young boy restrained himself at just the right moment. I believe that he was heeding the words of Villa Master Wang. A person shouldn't make their path in the cultivation world too narrow. Sure enough, Shan Hu slowly regained consciousness after Wang Yiran carried her back to the waterside pavilion and tapped several of her acupoints. Apart from appearing extremely disheveled, being completely soaked, having some of her skin revealed, and losing all of her face, her condition and aura seemed fairly okay. She struggled to stand up, and her forehead was red and swollen as she stood with her back facing the others. She propped a hand against a column and placed her other hand over her mouth. The soaked and slender young girl had watery eyes, and appeared charmingly pitiful in stark contrast to her normally aloof nature. The young girl who was joining in on the fun with no regard for the serious nature of the situation craned her neck and dazedly looked at Chun Ping'an drinking on the mountain path. "Wow, he's truly a powerful person," she exclaimed in astonishment. The young scholar stole a quick glance at Shan Hu's slender figure, which was on full display thanks to her drenched clothes. The corners of his lips curled up into a slight smile. Her legs were long and shapely, and the naive young boy was most likely unfamiliar with the flavor of such legs. To experienced young masters from powerful clans like him, however, it was well known that such legs were the most damaging to the health of men. One issue had just concluded, but another issue immediately arose. There was a notion of subordinates sacrificing themselves when their master was humiliated in the cultivation world, and the man with the ox-horn bow seemingly saw the reserved snickers of a few other guards and subordinates as he stood among the other trusted subordinates in the waterside pavilion. His anger instantly filled him with courage. He let out a roar, then grabbed his precious bow which had taken a craftsman 10 years to make. At the same time, he grabbed an arrow with white fletching from his quiver and drew his bow to full. An evildoer like you dares to injure the young mistress? Eat my arrow. Unexpected situations were occurring one after another, so even unruly Sabervilla's Villa Master Wang, who was renowned for his composure and his steadfast techniques, couldn't help but feel a little angry. Malu, you can't shoot someone in the back, he bellowed. Chun Ping'an was already 100 paces away and was just about to turn back around. However, he faltered slightly and saw someone standing on a branch atop a towering tree with their hands clasped behind their back out of the corners of his eyes. The mountain wind brushed past, and the branch under the old man in black's feet also bounced up and down like gently undulating water. He appeared especially impressive as he stood there. The two of them exchanged a quick glance, and the old man quickly nodded in acknowledgement. Upon seeing this, Chun Ping'an abandoned his urge to lash out. However, he still turned around to face the waterside pavilion. The old man instantly vanished, then reappeared on the narrow mountain path in the next moment. He was like a wisp of smoke as he brushed past Chun Ping'an. He raised his arm and extended a finger, pointing it upward. An arrow sliced through the air, but it was stopped by the old man's fingertip just like that. The shaft of the arrow shattered under the immense force of the impact, yet the old man's finger remained unmoving and uninjured. The old man gently pinched the arrowhead with 2 fingers. With a casual toss, the arrowhead whistled back and pierced through the hand of the archer. The man was a fearless person, however, and he refused to drop his ox-horn bow just because of this. His wounded hand hung limply by his side, but he still held his bow up with the other. His eyes were wide with anger and ferocity as he glared at the uninvited guest. When journeying through the cultivation world, one is responsible for one's own life and death, the old man in black said with a cold expression. Have your elders not taught you this simple principle before? So be it if you don't follow any rules in other areas of the cultivation world in Watercombing Nation. You can do whatever you like. However, this is unacceptable in Sword Water Villa. Song Fengshan's wife stood up and performed an elegant curtsy. Patriarch, she greeted respectfully. Wang Iran's expression changed slightly, and he hurriedly cupped his fists and lowered his head. Unruly Sabervilla's Wang Iran pays his respects to Sword Saint Song. The young scholar immediately smacked the young girl's head, signaling for her to stand up. He then bowed and said, Mount Xiaochong's Han clan disciple, Han Yuanshan, pays his respects to old Villa Master. The young girl was a lively person who wasn't frightened by the situation at all. She copied her older brother, bowing but not lowering her head. She looked straight ahead at the extremely famous immortal and said in a childish voice, Mount Xiaochong's Han clan disciple, Han Yunxue, pays her respects to old Villa Master. After Sword Saint Song Yuxiao showed himself, his grandson, Song Fengshan, was surprisingly the last person to stand up. His voice was emotionless as he slowly said, Grandfather, your trip to the outside world was quite short this time. I thought that you would only be willing to return after all of the guests left and the villa became quiet and peaceful again. The old man looked around, and he simply remarked, What a foul atmosphere. He then turned around and simply left with Chun Ping'an. The influential Han clan from Watercombing Nation's Mount Xiaochong, the villa master of unruly Saber Villa? He paid no heed to these things, as if they were all beneath him. The old villa master couldn't be bothered even taking an extra glance at them. Song Yuxiao walked side by side with Chun Ping'an, and his expression only became slightly forlorn after he turned his back to the others. After walking half a kilometer, he said in self-ridicule, My clan has gone astray, and they're even inferior to a waterfall now. Apologies for the embarrassing sight. Chun Ping'an didn't know how to respond, so he could only reply with some generic but polite words. The people in the villa are actually quite fine. They're not as bad as you make them out to be, senior. Every family had their own hardships, so the old man was unwilling to talk about the shortcomings of his clan in front of outsiders regardless of how magnanimous and open-minded he was. He changed the topic and said, Why did you suddenly change your mind when you threw that punch? Why did you only use 30 or 40% of your strength? The future villa master of Unruly Saber Villa is a stubborn person who isn't easy to deal with. She might not appreciate your mercy, and she might even cause you trouble in the future. Nowadays, people in the cultivation world only care about their own feelings and happiness. I strongly but I'm also unable to appreciate your lack of firmness. Chun Ping'an drank some wine and used the back of his hand to wipe his mouth. He smiled and replied, punching someone to death simply because I'm unhappy is far too much. In any case, I'm about to leave Watercombing Nation very soon, so it won't be easy for Unruly Saber Villa to cause trouble for me even if they want to. What's she going to do? Curse me behind my back. It's not like I can hear her curses anyway. Song Yuxiao turned around to glance at Chun Ping'an, who had a sincere expression on his face. His attitude was unexpected, yet it was also understandable at the same time. Song Yuxiao smiled and remarked, it's fine for a bunch of old bones like me to say something, as I already have 1 foot in the grave. Nothing matters anymore, so what can I do? However, you're only 15 or 16, right? It's truly boring to hear you speak in such a mature manner. Chun Ping'an didn't rebut the old man. The gloominess weighing on his mind had already cleared up significantly after he threw that punch, and this was already enough. He suddenly recalled something and warned in a quiet voice. The mama from the old temple who referred to herself as one of the 4 evil spirits of Watercombing Nation has come to your villa with a huge man. You need to be careful, senior. Song Yuxiao laughed heartily and replied, this is nothing, counting the young master from the Han clan who's sitting in the waterside pavilion. The infamous 4 evil spirits of Watercombing Nation have all gathered in my villa already. Who's the final evil spirit? Chun Ping'an asked in puzzlement. Let's not mention them, replied Song Yuxiao with a bitter smile, shaking his head. Chun Ping'an drank a mouthful of wine and thought about some things. The old man understood his intention, and he honestly explained, there's no scheme behind my invitation to you and your companions. I simply hope that the villa won't be filled with dogs and pigs wearing human skin. After all, this Sword Water Villa is something I built myself from the ground up, so I don't want dogs hit to be lying around everywhere. A pile here and a puddle there. Just walking around my own place disgusts me. With you and your companions staying as guests here, I feel much more pleased and comfortable. Chun Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. This senior was far too honest and frank. However, what Chun Ping'an didn't know was the fact that while becoming increasingly renowned as a sword saint, Song Yuxiao was also nicknamed Iron Knob by those in the same generation. This referred to Song Yuxiao's unsmiling nature, both at home and even more in the cultivation world. If one tried to claim that Song Fengshan had a completely different personality to his grandfather, Song Yuxiao, then that would be a misjudgment of the young sword immortal's character. It was just that Song Yuxiao was radiating with the stubborn and restricted nature of cultivators from the past generations. These were things that Song Fengshan was unwilling to adhere to as he pursued the pinnacle of the sword Dao. Song Yuxiao was past 70, and he had encountered far too many storms and come across far too many sinister people during his travels through the cultivation world. Thus, he was increasingly certain of one thing. A person should only reason with those who were reasonable. Under all other circumstances, his rusty iron sword was the only argument he had and the only argument he needed. Song Yuxiao liked to travel around with only his sword as a companion, and he had seen many impressive young prodigies during the past few years. They were truly talented, yet their martial virtue truly left much to be desired. However, they were still very successful, and were still admired by countless people in the cultivation world. There was something that Song Yuxiao didn't really understand. The cultivation world would be handed over to these people in maybe 50 years, so what was there to look forward to at that time? No matter how talented with the sword Song Yuxiao was, he was only a single person, after all. Those in the same generation as him were passing away one after another, taking with them the old principles that the youths didn't like listening to. These principles were buried 6 feet under along with them. Now that his half-friend half-enemy, the old sword god of colorful garment nation, had died, Song Yuxiao felt even more demotivated and uninterested. He felt like the current cultivation world was bland and tasteless. The wine had lost its flavor. The old man and the young boy casually strolled around with nothing to do. After a while, Song Yuxiao suddenly said, "Those people in the waterside pavilion had bad eyes, and they were unable to determine the level of your fist intent. However, I was able to see it clearly, so let me be nosy and tell you this. There's something wrong with your mental state right now, and the barrier between the 3rd tier and the 4th tier is the first major barrier for us martial artists. The more solid your foundation is, the more susceptible you are to unexpected accidents if you advance to the 4th tier with knots in your heart. After all, an avalanche on a large mountain is hundreds upon thousands of times more terrifying than a landslide on a small mountain. Young lad, You have to be careful. Chun Ping'an was instantly frightened back to his senses. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, and he mulled over things for a few moments before turning around and saying, "Thank you for your warning, senior." Song Yushao thought for a bit before saying something that seemed to be completely irrelevant. Your decision to pull back just then was indeed a sign of your kindness. However, doing so was also a blemish when considering your advance to the next cultivation tier. If you had unleashed your full power just then, you would have probably killed that young girl, or at least you would have left her crippled. With that, you would have enraged everyone and the spar would have turned into a life and death battle. Perhaps that would have been your opportunity to break through to the next tier. Indeed, this is what immortals from the mountains refer to as a fated opportunity. Chun Ping'an smiled in response, but the truth was that didn't feel any regret at all. Rather, his reply was filled with a sense of maturity again. It doesn't matter. What is mine can't run away, and what isn't mine can't be caught. In fact, Song Yushao was carefully observing the subtle changes in Chun Ping'an's expression the entire time. The old man imperceptibly nodded upon seeing the calm demeanor and pure eyes of the young boy. The sword Dao pursued by this young boy and the Dao of his grandson Song Fengshan were completely different things. The gulf between them was like the gulf between heaven and earth. At this stage, it was too early to say who was right and who was wrong, and who could advance further and quicker. However, Song Yushao personally felt young boy from another nation, who had poor sword skills even though he was traveling around with a sword case, was more to his tastes than his prodigy of a grandson. In terms of educating future generations, scholarly clans were indeed more capable than forces from the cultivation world. Song Yushao wholeheartedly accepted this observation. He had focused most of his attention and effort on practicing with the sword during his earlier years, and this had resulted in him turning a blind eye to the development of his clan. Perhaps it could also be said that he had possessed few tools at his disposal. At most, he could only beat or scold his descendants. Looking back at these things now, the old man could only feel guilt and regret. In reality, Song Yushao felt like his situation was no better than that of unruly Sabervilla's Wang Iran. Etiquette came from aristocratic clans, while immortal powers came from martial sections. Genuine descendants of aristocratic clans were raised in an environment full of etiquette and rules ever since a young age. Similarly, immortal techniques were systematically passed down since ancient times in immortal forces in the mountains. Song Yushao was well aware of this fact. He had once traveled afar to southern Stream Nation, and had interacted with many renowned individuals over there. There were all kinds of people with different personalities, and they indeed all possessed their own demeanor and mannerisms. In fact, even the feeble scholars over there could cause one to feel embarrassed and ashamed. On the narrow mountain path linking the waterfall to Sword Water Villa, there was an exquisite and adorable resting station with upturned eaves. There was a plaque hanging at the entrance that read Mountain and Water, and the couplets on the two sides of the doorway read Jagged White Stones and Murmuring Limpid Water. These were very simple words but also unique in their own way. Song Yushao was very fond of this resting station, and he dragged Chun Ping'an over to sit on a long bench inside the pavilion. They sat opposite each other, and the old man placed his sword across his knees. Meanwhile, the young boy kept his swords on his back. One was a highly regarded sword saint, and one lacked the confidence to even launch a sword strike. Their view was wide, and the distant mountains were like the dark eyebrows of a beautiful woman. The mountain wind was refreshing, allowing one to feel relaxed and carefree. Song Yushao sat quietly, not even trying to make small talk with the young boy. He simply thought about some personal matters. His grandson, Song Fengshan, wasn't wildly ambitious when it came to matters regarding the cultivation world. Rather, it was his grandson's wife who was fanning the flames from behind the scenes. She was always whispering in his ears, and she had managed to persuade him that he was only doing some minor things in a convenient manner. It was because of this that he was going to become the alliance leader of the martial arts world. Not only that, but he was even going to lead both normal cultivators and demonic cultivators alike, going as far as to extend his influence into the imperial court as well. Otherwise, with Song Fengshan's temperament, how could he have cared about that princess from Watercombing Nation back then? Not killing her with a single slash was already showing strong restraint and benevolence. The Four Evil Spirits of Watercombing Nation was a recent title that had only appeared in the past 10 years. They weren't well known in the cultivation world, and generally speaking, only cultivation grandmasters at Wang Iran's level had heard of them before. The most powerful member of this group was the burly man who had arrived at Sword Water Villa with the so-called Mama. He had an immortal treasure, a silver halberd, and he had founded a demonic force in Watercombing Nation. Ranked second was the demonic young girl from the old temple, and after her was the seemingly unremarkable young master from the Han clan who had been sitting inside the waterside pavilion. He was from a famous clan, yet he cultivated demonic techniques instead. Not only that, but he had even won over and gained control of many high-ranking officials in Watercombing Nation. The weakest of the 4 evil spirits was seemingly far away, yet right in front of them at the same time. It was none other than Song Yuxiao's granddaughter-in-law. She had, coincidentally, become acquainted with Song Fengshan while he was traveling. Afterward, the two of them had become husband and wife without Song Yuxiao's knowledge or permission. Not only that, but they had even announced their marriage to the world. When Song Yuxiao had finally returned from his long trip, things were done already and couldn't be undone. What exasperated Song Yuxiao the most was the fact that the infatuated Song Fengshan admitted to knowing his wife's demonic identity. That time, Song Yuxiao had drawn his sword and shattered his eldest grandson's sword. Then, he had run his sword through the woman's stomach. Song Fengshan had gone wild with rage and tried to fight his grandpa with his life on the line. Frustrated and infuriated, Song Yuxiao had lashed out to sever his undutiful grandson's wrist tendons, comprehensively severing his ability to pursue the sword Dao, lest he harm others in the future. Unexpectedly, however, the woman had stepped forward to block the strike for Song Fengshan, even allowing the old man to pierce her heart. She hadn't died, but her bridge of immortality had been shattered. Afterward, she had become a feeble woman who would always get sick, even during colder spring days. These were unpleasant family matters, and Song Yuxiao had tried to use both reason and emotion to persuade his grandson. In the end, he had still failed to persuade him even after unleashing several sword strikes. In fact, things had become complicated and strained instead. Song Yuxiao heaved a long sigh. The mountain and water pavilion was surrounded by jagged white stones and murmuring limpid water. The scenery was beautiful, but the worldly affairs were disappointing. Senior Song, can I practice fist techniques at the waterfall for the next couple of days? Chun Pingyan suddenly asked. Song Yuxiao immediately agreed to his request without asking any questions. Why not? I'll immediately notify everyone that the area from the mountain and water pavilion to the waterfall is a restricted area of Swordwater Villa. Anyone who enters without permission will be punished by death. Chun Pingyan scratched his head in an uneasy manner. I can go over to practice my fist techniques at night when there's no one enjoying the scenery at the waterfall. There's no need to seal the area in the morning. That would be far too unreasonable. Song Yuxiao shook his head and laughed heartily, replying, You're far too reserved, young lad. Do I need to speak reason with others when sealing off an area and keeping it shit-free in my own territory? Chun Pingyan could only accept this and say, If there's anything the villa needs help with, please do let me know, senior. The old man patted the iron sword on his knees and huffed. My sword is different from the 2 swords on your back. An awkward expression appeared on Chun Pingyan's face, and he grabbed his sword-nurturing gourd and focused on drinking, not saying anything else. Song Yuxiao suppressed a chuckle and retied his sword to his waist. He then stood up and said, Feel free to practice your fist techniques whenever you want. You can stay in the villa for as long as you like. Oh, that's right, your wine doesn't smell good at all. When I get back, I'll tell someone to bring you a few jars of flower carving brew. It's been buried underground for almost 20 years, and that's what I call a good wine. Just what in the world are you drinking right now? It's no better than water. More importantly, you always like to take 1 or 2 sips regardless of whether there's anyone around. I can't help but feel embarrassed for you. With a tap of his foot, the old man swayed and instantly appeared on a tall branch in the distance. With a few nimble bounds, he immediately vanished from sight. Chun Pingyan sat in the mountain and water pavilion by himself. He had come across the senior twice, and he couldn't help but recall City God Shun, one from colorful Garment Nation's Blusher Prefecture. Even though one was a renowned pure martial artist in the cultivation world and one was a scholarly deity who enjoyed incense offerings. Oh, and there was also the Qi refiner who had taken Luan Luan as his disciple as well. He had a nagging feeling that the 3 of them were quite similar in a sense. However, he couldn't quite put a finger on what it was. In any case, Chun Pingyan felt like he genuinely couldn't buy the cheapest liquor for his wine gourd anymore after interacting with them. Well, this didn't matter. After all, he was soon about to receive the best wine in Swordwater Villa. Wasn't he? Most importantly, he didn't need to spend any money. And thus, Chun Pingyan was in a very good mood when he left the mountain and water pavilion and returned to his temporary residence. When he arrived in the courtyard, Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng exchanged a glance upon seeing his joyful expression. What was going on? Was visiting the waterfall that effective? Chun Pingyan happily sat down beside the stone table and chuckled. I'm going to practice fist techniques at the waterfall tonight. Who wants to come with me? Perhaps you peeped on a beautiful woman bathing near the waterfall? The big-bearded martial artist asked with a sly grin. If such a beautiful sight exists, then count me in. Zhang Shanfeng blinked and added, I can keep a lookout for the 2 of you. Chun Ping'an felt slightly exasperated, and he explained, "How can that be possible? In fact, I even got into a conflict with some people at the waterfall. I had a fight, and my opponent was seemingly someone from Unruly Saber Villa. Fortunately, Senior Song stepped in and helped me block an arrow from one of their subordinates. Otherwise, I most likely would have had to keep fighting them. If things continued like that, I might have ended up dragging the two of you down with me as well." Xianxia clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "Chun Ping'an, drag us down as well? I'm an unrefined man, so how can you covet my beauty? If you ask me, I'd say that Zhang Shanfeng is indeed quite beautiful. When I go to the small town, I'll help him buy some female clothes. Afterward, we can get him to wander around the waterfall. Maybe I'll even become a matchmaker for the two of you and successfully unite you in love and marriage." Chun Ping'an almost spat out the wine that he was drinking. Zhang Shanfeng feigned vomiting, and he hurriedly scurried away from his two friends. There was mock anger on his face as he exclaimed, "Even rabbits don't feed on the grass beside their nests. Yet, the two of you are actually targeting your brother as well? You're taking things too far." Chun Ping'an quietly stood up and walked over to sit on another stone chair, distancing himself from Xianxia. The big-bearded martial artist stroked his beard and asked, "What's wrong? For the sake of our brothers, we should even be willing to take blades to our chests. That being the case, what's wrong with changing into female clothes? Brother, you can't be so disloyal." Zhang Shanfeng cupped his fists and begged for forgiveness, continually retreating as he said, "I'm going to study some classics in my room. Since the two of you are so loyal, why don't you enjoy the conversation by yourselves?" Xianxia roared with laughter. Chun Ping'an smiled knowingly. Steward Chu coincidentally arrived at this moment, and he had come with a few subordinates to deliver 4 large jars of flavorful wine. He left after delivering them, but it was clear that he was behaving more respectfully and cheerfully toward Chun Ping'an. In reality, Zhang Shanfeng didn't like to drink. Thus, Chun Ping'an was just about to split the wine in half with Xianxia, giving him 2 of the 4 jars. However, Xianxia hesitated for a moment before smiling and shaking his head, saying, "1 jar is enough for me. You can take 3, Chun Ping'an." Chun Ping'an was slightly puzzled. Xianxia looked around and didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Only then did he point at the vermilion wine gourd by Chun Ping'an's waist and chuckle softly. "Do you really think I didn't notice anything? I didn't travel around the cultivation world for nothing, and I was simply too embarrassed to say anything in the past." This is similar to how Zhang Shanfeng introduced himself as Zhang Shan at the start. Who doesn't have some secrets when adventuring through the cultivation world? Your wine gourd is either a legendary pocket treasure from the immortal forces or it's an even more valuable sword-nurturing gourd. Am I correct? The big-bearded martial artist pointed at his eyes and said, "Haha, I can already see through everything." Chun Ping'an didn't deny anything, and he replied softly, "I'm sorry for hiding this from the two of you for so long." Xianxia rolled his eyes and huffed, "Come on, what is there to apologize about? Being careless in the cultivation world is the true crime toward one's friends." A forlorn expression appeared on the big-bearded martial artist's face after he said this. He cracked open a jar of beautiful Mountain Villa wine that had been sealed for a long time and poured some into his ordinary wine pot. He swished it around after filling it, and he added, "I'm not trying to be polite. I suffered a lot myself, so I know how things are." Xianxia gulped down large mouthfuls of wine. There was still more than half a jar remaining, so he could definitely drink his fill. Chun Ping'an didn't say anything upon seeing that Xianxia was in low spirits. He also started drinking, but he drank slowly, unlike the big-bearded martial artist who was lapping it up like a cow. Xianxia downed an entire pot of wine in a few breaths. His beard was filled with beads of wine, and he casually wiped it with his hand before chuckling and asking, "Your wine gourd is filled with the same wine, but will it taste different from mine?" Chun Ping'an smiled and tossed his wine gourd to the big-bearded martial artist. "Here, try it yourself." Xianxia raised the sword-nurturing gourd high into the air before tilting his head backward and gulping down a large mouthful of wine. He then tossed the wine gourd back to Chun Ping'an and remarked in satisfaction, "It does taste a bit better." "What bullshit?" Chun Ping'an replied with a grin. "The wine in my wine gourd is the cheapest wine from some small town. How can it compare to the Mountain Villa's 20-year flower carving brew?" Xianxia was slightly drunk, with his face flushed red as he stood up and shakily walked to his room. He was going to have a nice, long sleep. However, he stopped, turned around and replied with a grin, "It's the wine of a future great sword immortal, so how can it not taste good? It tastes very good." He turned back toward the door and stumbled several steps forward. His head swayed back and forth as he murmured to himself, "I, Xianxia, can brag about this forever." Even though night had already fallen, Sword Water Villa was still brightly lit. All of the courtyards, big and small, were filled with guests, and they went through countless jars of fine wine in a single night. It was said that after the event, even those in the small town were able to smell the aroma of wine drifting over from the villa. Qian Pingyan had inquired Steward Chu about the ferry station, and there was indeed one in Watercombing Nation, over 300 kilometers away from Swordwater Villa. It was situated on the border of Watercombing Nation and Pinestream Nation, and it was said that cultivators frequently appeared there. However, the entire area in a radius of 150 kilometers around the ferry station had been marked as a restricted area by the imperial family of Watercombing Nation, and anyone who dared to venture into the area without a special permit was punished by execution. The old steward was a very thoughtful man, and he told Qian Pingyan that Swordwater Villa was on very good terms with the chief military governor's manor situated on the border, and all they would have to do would be to send a letter to the manor to receive the special permit. So that wasn't something that Qian Pingyan had to worry about. Zhang Shanfeng asked the old steward whether there were any shops run by cultivators at the ferry station where he could exchange for certain things, and the old steward confirmed this to be the case. After Song Fengshan's original sword was damaged, he had paid the ferry station a visit and brought back the short sword that he was currently carrying. The old steward was eager to share everything that he knew, and not only did he reveal all of this insider information about Watercombing Nation, he shared that Song Fengshan had spent 900 snowflake coins to purchase that short sword by the name of Vast Water, and that was close to half of the villa's entire wealth. Of course, the steward wasn't so willing to spill his guts because he was overly trusting and naive. Instead, it was because Sword Saint Song had told him that when it came to these three, particularly Qian Pingyan, he could treat them as if they were his closest friends, and that the villa didn't have to be wary of them at all. Fulfilling one's promises no matter what, sticking by one's friends even through life and death, cherishing friendship with all one's heart. Those were the mantras that Song Yuxiao had abided by his entire life. Steward Chu had served Song Yuxiao for 60 years, and during that time he had given everything to the villa, sticking with the villa through thick and thin, and sometimes even putting his life on the line. It was only because Song Yuxiao's way of life had rubbed off on him that he had been willing to serve the villa so diligently and wholeheartedly. After enjoying a lavish feast in Zhang Shanfeng's room, Qian Pingyan prepared to depart to the waterfall to practice his fist techniques. However, Zhang Shanfeng suddenly told him to wait. Xianxia had one foot resting on a bench, using a toothpick to pick at his teeth, and he asked if Zhang Shanfeng needed him to leave. Zhang Shanfeng assured him that he could stay, then rushed over to open his bags before pulling out a pair of bamboo chopsticks that he pushed toward Qian Pingyan across the table. "Why are you giving me this? We've already finished our meal, haven't we?" Qian Pingyan asked with a curious expression. The pair of bamboo chopsticks on the table were part of the spoils that Zhang Shanfeng had reaped from the battle back in the Blusher Prefecture, one of which had the characters Azure Divine Mountain inscribed upon it, while the other bore the inscription of Divine Cloud Bamboo. "They're yours now," Zhang Shanfeng said with a smile. "This will serve as my interest repayment for that armor pellet that you gave me. There's nothing I hate more than owing people money, and just the thought of any debt is enough to ruin my sleep and my appetite, let alone a debt of 500 snowflake coins, which would convert to 500,000 taels of silver." Steward Chu said that the total wealth of the entire Swordwater Villa only amounts to fewer than 3 million taels of silver. "If I don't give you something in return, I won't be able to sleep at night at all." An exasperated look appeared on Qian Pingyan's face. "Are you an idiot? If these chopsticks really are crafted from divine cloud bamboo, you can easily sell them for a few hundred snowflake coins. Even if they aren't made from divine cloud bamboo, the spiritual energy that's lingered on the chopsticks for several centuries can't be faked. So even at the very least, it's still an acquired spirit tool that can be sold for a couple dozen snowflake coins. What kind of interest repayment could possibly be this high? What do you take me for? A loan shark?" Qian Pingyan became more and more enraged as he spoke, and he pushed the chopsticks back to Zhang Shanfeng as he continued. "Besides, we're about to go to the ferry station in Watercombing Nation soon, and there are shops that sell immortal treasures there. So let's have these chopsticks appraised first to determine their value before we think about anything else. If they're only worth about a dozen snowflake coins, then I'll accept them, but if they're worth anything over 50 snowflake coins, then I definitely won't be taking them as interest." Zhang Shanfeng shook his head as he objected in a determined voice. "I can't accept that. My conscience won't allow it. Taoists like myself fear internal demons above all else. So if you don't accept these chopsticks, you'll be hindering my pursuit of the great Tao." Qian Pingyan rose to his feet as he scoffed. "What a load of horse dung. This is not negotiable. You're keeping these chopsticks, and that's final. If you don't want to accept that, then let's have a fight, and the winner gets to decide." Zhang Shanfeng fell silent upon hearing this. Qian Pingyan also didn't say anything further as he departed to practice his fist techniques by the waterfall. Zhang Shanfeng heaved a forlorn sigh, then turned to Su Yuanxia as he asked, "What should I do?" A hint of schadenfreude appeared on Su Yuanxia's face as he chuckled. "I can't believe you just tried to thrust your wealth upon someone as wealthy as Chen Ping'an." Zhang Shanfeng was feeling a little frustrated, and he poured a cup of wine for himself before taking a small sip, upon which his face instantly became brightly flushed. Unbeknownst to Chen Ping'an and Su Yuanxia, during that battle against old Demon Mi's eldest disciple back in the Blusher Prefecture, Zhang Shanfeng had called upon the armor pellet in what appeared to be a dire situation, and it was only thanks to the suit of radiant armor that he was able to shield Daoist Chong Miao from a lethal blow. Daoist Chong Miao had been utterly astonished, as he had immediately recognized the suit of radiant armor. He told Zhang Shanfeng that he only knew of one such armor pellet in Ancient Elm Nation's Imperial Vault. It was said that the #1 martial artist of Pine Stream Nation had once offered to purchase the armor pellet from Ancient Elm Nation for 6,000 light snow coins, but was turned down by Ancient Elm Nation's emperor. This was something that had been constantly weighing on Zhang Shanfeng's mind ever since then, but he didn't know how to bring up the subject to Chen Ping'an. After that, following the incident at the old temple, Chen Ping'an had become uncharacteristically quiet and withdrawn, making it even more difficult for Zhang Shanfeng to approach him for a conversation. Now that they had arrived at Swordwater Villa and were about to travel to the ferry station, Zhang Shanfeng was finally unable to bear the torment any longer. Hence, he revealed everything to Su Yuanxia, and after hearing his story, Su Yuanxia set two things straight for Zhang Shanfeng. The first thing was that Chen Ping'an was definitely aware of the true value of the armor pellet, and he had said it was only worth 500 snowflake coins because he knew that Zhang Shanfeng wouldn't accept it otherwise. The second thing was that Chen Ping'an had definitely had an impoverished upbringing, but what was just as certain was that he had attained an enormous amount of wealth since then, as evidenced by the fact that he was staying in a heaven-grade suite while traveling on the Kuan ship. However, it seemed that he had never placed too much weight on wealth and material belongings, at least when it came to his friends. Hence, this was no longer just a simple matter of Zhang Shanfeng owing him money. Instead, he owed Chen Ping'an a massive favor. In conclusion, Su Yuanxia didn't directly tell Zhang Shanfeng what to do. Instead, he laid out two more things, the first of which was to caution Zhang Shanfeng to never take the kindness of his friends for granted, while the second thing was that debts had to be repaid no matter what, even between brothers, let alone friends. Only then would a relationship be able to last. If one were to think that debts didn't have to be repaid between friends, then they would inevitably be burning their bridges, and they would come to rue their own naivety someday. This was why Zhang Shanfeng had hatched the idea of giving those bamboo chopsticks to Chen Ping'an under the guise of an interest repayment. As for why he hadn't tried to give Chen Ping'an that white bowl that could slowly absorb spiritual energy and manifest them into droplets of dew, that was because that bowl was an item of the utmost importance to his cultivation as a qi refiner. In contrast, Chen Ping'an was a pure martial artist, so the bowl would only benefit him very slightly, and even if he were to receive it, he would most likely only sell it for some light snow coins. Zhang Shanfeng's face was bright red with inebriation as he continued to sip on wine, and he sighed. "Can you point out a path for me, Brother Su? I am truly stumped." Su Yuanxia put on a serious expression as he said, "If worst comes to worst, how about you put on some women's clothes and go to him like that?" On the way here, it seems like Chen Ping'an hasn't displayed any interest in women or female ghosts at all. If anything, he was really quick to fight them when he had to. Su Yuanxia was clearly making a joke out of the situation, and Zhang Shanfeng heaved a forlorn sigh before slumping down onto the table, where he promptly fell asleep. Meanwhile, Su Yuanxia was stroking his own beard with a contemplative expression, and two images surfaced in his mind, the first of which was when Chen Ping'an had told that woman in the dilapidated old temple to hold her hands over the fire if she felt cold. After that, she had turned into a female ghost, and Chen Ping'an had grabbed her by the throat before raining down punches upon her until she ceased to exist. He then thought of the incident that Chen Ping'an had just mentioned, where he had punched that young woman straight into the pool at the waterfall, and he couldn't help but shudder as he exclaimed to himself, "Holy shit! He's not actually into men, is he?" Meanwhile, the banquet continued in the main hall of Swordwater Villa. Large, colorful rugs had been draped over the ground in the hall. They were known as ground gowns, something that was unique to Jinu Prefecture of colorful garment nation. Villa Master Song Yushao was still unwilling to come out and entertain the guests, so Song Fengshan was seated on the main chair. Beside him was his kind and capable wife, who had always carried herself with exceptional poise. Not only was she exceptional at dealing with internal family affairs, her handling of external affairs was also extremely praiseworthy, but despite how capable she was, she took care to never outshine her husband. This was why even though Song Fengshan was constantly in seclusion, his reputation was only continuing to grow in Watercombing Nation, to the point that he was able to hold all-encompassing martial gatherings. All of the representatives of Watercombing Nation's top-ranking sects had already arrived, and aside from these significant figures in the cultivating world, There were also several formidable itinerant cultivators and old seniors who had been absent from the public eye for a long time. All of them were quite advanced in age, and even a pair of extremely respected and venerable senior figures had taken this opportunity to reunite after many years, lending the event even more prestige. Han Yuanshan and Han Yuanxue were also present, but their seats were situated further down the back. They were technically representatives of the authorities, so they were very much out of place here. Swordwater Villa and the Han clan weren't actually on very good terms with one another, so if they were to sit too close to the front, then that would be sure to attract speculation and complaints from the other guests present. Wang Yiran and Wang Shanfu of Unruly Saber Villa had been arranged better seats than the Han siblings, and Han Yuanxue was quite displeased by this, feeling as if she and her brother were being shunned by the villa, and that nowhere in Watercombing Nation should they be subjected to this type of treatment. In contrast, Han Yuanshan was completely unbothered, flapping his folding fan gently with one hand while raising his cup for toasts with the other. Despite his refined and scholarly appearance, Han Yuanshan actually had an astonishing alternative identity as one of the 4 evil spirits of Watercombing Nation. Even though Watercombing Nation had a ferry station, there was actually no cultivating power within its borders. Hence, the 4 evil spirits, which was a rather unflattering name for a group, actually referred to the handful of most powerful cultivators in Watercombing Nation. Of course, besides being one of the 4 evil spirits, Han Yuanshan also had a clean identity as a member of the Han clan of Mount Xiaochong, and had countless friends and acquaintances that occupied official posts. Hence, he was granted free passage wherever he went, including even the vastly renowned Swordwater Villa. In front of a lone table to the left side of the hall sat a burly man and a young woman. There was a clear gap between this table and all of the other ones, as everyone present was aware of the man's identity. He was none other than the leading figure of Watercombing Nation's underworld. His name was Do Yang, and he appeared to be a young man in his prime, but it was said that he was already over 100 years of age. He proclaimed himself to be the leader of the demonic orthodoxy, and had a dozen of demonic enforcers under his command. He was a dominant force in the southern region of Watercombing Nation, but thankfully, he largely kept to himself on the border of Watercombing Nation and Pinestream Nation, keeping a relatively low profile over the past few decades. However, all of the individuals of the older generation present were extremely resentful and wary of him. 50 years ago, 3 horrific battles were waged for the sake of territory in Watercombing Nation between the righteous orthodoxy and the demonic orthodoxy, and thousands of powerful righteous cultivators lost their lives in those battles. The fact that the Swordwater Villa dared to make such an arrangement for Do Yang and his maidservant rather than granting him a seat at the front of the hall instantly won everyone's admiration, and it also earned Song Fengshan a great deal of respect. Even though Song Fengshan was the host of this event, he was very sparing with his words, mostly drinking wine by himself instead of forcing himself to make conversation with others. Occasionally, someone would try and strike up a conversation with him by mentioning their bond with his father, but at the very most, all they would receive in response would be a toast. In contrast, his wife was familiar with everyone and their past feats, and she was even aware of the achievements of some of the young prodigies present. She would always make sure to bring up these topics when conversing with them, and as a result, not only did no one feel as if they had been shunned, everyone felt acknowledged and appreciated. As usual, she was carrying herself in exceptional fashion, and no one could fault her as the hostess of the event. Meanwhile, the mama from the ancient temple, who had been mistaken by everyone as Do Yang's personal maidservant, was observing all of the guests present in a subtle fashion. Occasionally, she would make eye contact with Han Yuanshan, but only for an instant each time before both looked away. However, whenever this happened, she would give him a seductive smile or an alluring look, and those details certainly weren't missed by Han Yuanshan. He would also make some subtle gestures in reciprocation, fanning the flames of desire in the mama's heart. As she lowered her head to drink some wine, she stuck out her tongue and ran it halfway around the edge of her cup, causing Han Yuanshan to gulp involuntarily. He had personally experienced her skills in the bedroom before, and it was an unforgettable experience every single time. Even though he possessed exceptional aptitude and had cultivated certain demonic secret techniques, he was still no match for her under the covers. None of this had escaped Do Yang's notice, and he sneered, "Can you restrain yourself for 1 second, you slut? Oh, are you jealous?" The young woman chuckled. Do Yang took a sip of wine and paid no heed to her jibes. In contrast with the pursuit of the great Tao, things like romantic love were of zero consequence. Wang Yiran could clearly sense his daughter's disappointment, as well as the deep affection and pain in her eyes as she snuck furtive glances at Song Fengshan. Wang Yiran knew that no positive outcome could have ever arisen from this one-sided love, but at the same time he saw no need to intervene and try and force them apart. Unruly Saber Villa was beneath Swordwater Villa anyway, so he had no right to say anything in this matter. Furthermore, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing for his daughter to go through some hardships, such as suffering from an unrequited love, or being knocked unconscious by a single punch. All of these hardships would help her become a more capable villa master in the future, and it was certainly better than having her grow up sheltered and incompetent. With that in mind, Wang Yiran decided to turn a blind eye to all of this. In their youth, almost all master cultivators had multiple love interests, but how many of them were actually worth pursuing? Once one reached the very pinnacle of the world, they would discover that nothing truly mattered aside from the pursuit of the great Tao. With that in mind, he couldn't help but think of Han Yuanshan. It was said that he was constantly entertaining love interests, and the most remarkable thing about him was that he could make all types of women completely devoted to him, whether they be daughters of high-ranking officials, female disciples of renowned sects, cold and bloodthirsty killers, revered and admired celestial maidens. None of them were immune to his charms. If his daughter were to fall in love with someone like that, then Wang Yiran would be sure to forcefully intervene. Otherwise, there would undoubtedly come a day when unruly Saber Villa would fall into Han Yuanshan's hands. It was clear that Han Yuanshan was an extremely cunning and ambitious man, and he definitely had some people with exceptional foresight instructing him from the shadows. Working with someone like him for mutual benefit was certainly a good idea, but actually befriending such a sinister individual would be no different from courting death. As for his daughter's love for Song Fengshan, Wang Yiran didn't see that as a problem, as Song Fengshan was a righteous individual. If Song Fengshan were willing to take Wang Shanfu as his wife, then Wang Yiran wouldn't even be opposed to the idea of having unruly Saber Villa merge with Swordwater Villa. Of course, the new collective villa would have the word Saber in its name, and one of their future children had to inherit the Wang surname. If such an alliance were to be forged, then in 100 years from now, the Wang and the Song surnames would be the only two surnames that mattered in Watercombing Nation. Right at this moment, someone offered a toast to Wang Yiran, and he raised his cup with a smile in reciprocation. Even though Wang Shanfu was quite distracted, she had enough etiquette to follow her father in reciprocating the toast. After setting down his cup, Wang Yiran cast his gaze forward as he asked, "Are you still thinking about what happened with that boy? You must feel like the only way to alleviate your humiliation would be to have him killed, right? Let me offer you some words of advice. That boy is no ordinary person. Even Song Fengshan is already regarding him as a potential rival, and it seems like there are some ties between him and Old Sword Saint Song as well. Han Yuanshan speculates that he may be a prized disciple of Colorful Garment Nation's sword god, and I think may very well be right. If that's the case, then he's only left Colorful Garment Nation in order to avoid his master's enemies in the wake of his passing. Sword Saint Song shared a very close bond with Colorful Garment Nation's sword god, and that's most likely why he's taking such care to look after that boy, even going as far as to personally teach Ma Lu a lesson." Wang Shanfu gripped the hilt of her saber tightly in her hand as she lowered her head and countered, "Am I just supposed to let this slide then, father? If that bastard had severely injured me or even beaten me to death in front of that waterside pavilion, then so be it, I'll just have to concede. But he went out of his way to humiliate me in front of so many people. How can I go anywhere from now on? Am I just going to have to stay my entire life in unruly Saber Villa?" Wang Yiran slammed his cup heavily down onto the table as he sneered. "Why can't you go anywhere? Because you're embarrassed? Because you're afraid people won't respect you? Respect is something that you have to earn by winning battles. If you're weak, people will remember your humiliation forever. But if you're strong, you'll find that everyone is remarkably forgetful of such things. In a few decades, when you become an even more formidable saber master than myself, when you rise to the 6th tier alongside the likes of Colorful Garment Nation's Sword God and Sword Saint Song, no one will ever mention this incident again. All everyone is going to talk about is which master swordsman you've defeated, how many demonic cultivators you've slain, and how many heroic feats you've achieved." Wang Shanfu's shoulders were trembling slightly as she hung her head and said in a dejected voice, "But I can't even beat a no-name swordsman younger than myself. Worse yet, I couldn't even take a single punch from him. How am I ever going to get to your level, let alone surpass you?" In the region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent where Watercombing Nation was situated, the 6th tier was already considered to the upper limit for pure martial artists, and no one had progressed beyond that level in the past few centuries, so if anyone were to reach the 7th tier, then they would virtually be considered to be an invincible deity. It was said that Colorful Garment Nation's sword god had been on the cusp of reaching the 7th tier at his peak, but ultimately, he seemed to have become disillusioned for some reason, following which his cultivation base plummeted, and he vanished out of the public eye entirely. Song Yushao had once stated in a very candid and straightforward fashion that there was no way he would ever be able to reach that level in this lifetime.